Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The stranger in the bar. The bar was nearly empty that evening, just the way I liked it. A few regulars were scattered around, sipping their drinks in comfortable silence. I sat in my usual corner, nursing a whiskey, the amber liquid catching the low light from the antique chandeliers overhead. Outside, rain droned steadily against the windows, drying out the hum of the city beyond. I was lost in my thoughts when I noticed him. The man stood at the entrance, his silhouette sharp against the dim glow of the neon sign outside. He hesitated for a moment before stepping in, shaking rain from his dark overcoat. He wasn't a regular, that much was clear. Something about him unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. He walked straight to the bar, bypassing the empty tables and ignoring the bartender's polite greeting. Instead of ordering, he placed his hands on the counter and scanned the room. His gaze landed on me. I froze, feeling the weight of his stare, cold and calculating. A moment later, he slid onto a stool, his back to me. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing on my drink, but my instincts screamed at me to leave. There was something off about him, the stillness in his posture, the way his shoulders remained rigid as if bracing for something. The bartender approached him cautiously. "What'll it be?" he asked. The stranger didn't respond immediately. Then, in a low, almost mechanical voice, he said, "Just water. No ice." The bartender shot me a glance, eyebrows raised. I shrugged, pretending not to care, but I couldn't stop watching. My grip tightened around my glass. Minutes passed. The stranger didn't drink his water. He just sat there, motionless. Then, without turning, he spoke again. "Why are you watching me?" My heart skipped a beat. He hadn't looked back, hadn't moved an inch, yet he knew. "I'm not," I replied, forcing my voice to sound steady. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Yes, you are." Something about his tone made my skin crawl. I stood, ready to leave, but when I moved, so did he. Slowly, deliberately, he turned on the stool to face me. His eyes were hollow. Not metaphorically, literally hollow. Dark pits stared back at me, void of life, of humanity. I couldn't breathe. "You shouldn't have come here tonight," he said, his voice quieter now but laced with something primal, something wrong. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. The bartender was gone. The regulars had vanished. It was just the two of us, the rain pounding harder outside, drowning out the sound of my ragged breaths. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. He stood, impossibly tall, and took a step toward me. "To finish what you started." I didn't understand, but I didn't wait to find out. I bolted for the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I shoved it open and ran into the rain-soaked street, not daring to look back. But as I turned the corner, I felt it, a presence behind me, closer than it should have been. And then, I heard his voice, a whisper that cut through the storm, "You can't escape." The ghost on the island. The lake stretched before me, a black mirror reflecting the deep indigo sky. The rowboat creaked beneath me as I gripped the oars, each stroke slicing through the icy water. It was a dare, a stupid one at that, but I couldn't back out now. My friends were watching from the shore, their laughter distant and mocking. "Spend an hour on the island," they'd said, "if you're not too scared." The island loomed ahead, a dark mass of trees and tangled undergrowth. There were stories, of course, there always were. People talked about strange sounds, a figure glimpsed among the trees, whispers carried across the water. But stories didn't scare me. At least, that's what I told myself. When the boat scraped against the rocky shore, I exhaled in relief. I secured the rope to a gnarled root and stepped onto the island, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The silence was immediate and absolute, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your own breathing sound too loud. I pulled my flashlight from my pocket and clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and thick moss clinging to the trunks. The trees felt alive, their shapes distorted and menacing in the pale light. I walked a little further, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. My goal was simple: stay for an hour, maybe snap a photo or two to prove I was here, and then row back. Easy. Or so I thought. The first sound was faint, like the rustle of fabric in the breeze. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Slowly, I turned, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. Just shadows shifting as the light moved. I shook my head, laughing softly to myself. "Get a grip," I muttered, though the words felt hollow. Then came the second sound, a whisper, soft and barely audible, like someone speaking just behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The whisper stopped. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as if struggling against some unseen force. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay calm. "It's just the batteries," I told myself. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, pale and still. It was a woman, or something that looked like one. Her hair hung in damp strands over her face, her dress clinging to her thin frame as if she'd just climbed from the lake. "Who's there?" I shouted, but my voice barely rose above a whisper. She didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stood there, her head tilting slightly as if curious. I took a step back, the flashlight shaking so badly the beam danced wildly. My heel caught on a root, and I stumbled, falling hard against the cold earth. When I looked up, she was closer. I hadn't seen her move. "Stay back," I shouted, scrambling to my feet. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the faint light. She raised a hand, pale and skeletal, pointing at me. Her lips parted, and the whisper returned, louder now, incomprehensible but insistent. I turned and ran. Branches clawed at my jacket, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't stop. The boat was just ahead, the outline of it barely visible in the moonlight. When I reached the shore, I threw myself into the boat, untying the rope with trembling fingers. I pushed off, grabbing the oars and rowing as fast as I could. The island receded into the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder, and there she was, standing at the edge of the water, her hollow eyes fixed on me. The whispers followed me all the way back to shore. The poltergeist in the new house. Moving into the new house was supposed to be a fresh start. The place wasn't much, but it was mine: 2 bedrooms, a cozy kitchen, and an overgrown backyard that promised potential. It had been a steal, almost too good to be true, but I didn't think much about it. I needed somewhere to start over, and this seemed perfect. The first night was quiet. I unpacked a few boxes, set up the bed, and fell asleep almost immediately. But by the second night, things started to feel off. It began with small noises. The creak of floorboards in the hallway, even though I was alone. A faint tapping on the kitchen window, though no one was there when I checked. I told myself it was just the quirks of an old house settling, the wind brushing tree branches against the glass. But then, the knocks came. I was in the living room, unpacking books, when I heard it, 3 deliberate knocks on the wall behind me. They were so precise, so measured, that I froze, a book slipping from my hands. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence. I stood there for a moment, listening, my pulse thundering in my ears. When nothing else happened, I laughed nervously. "Probably just the pipes," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. That night, I struggled to sleep. The house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin and fills your head with imagined sounds. I tossed and turned, my eyes darting to every shadow that shifted in the faint moonlight spilling through the blinds. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke with a start to the sound of something crashing in the kitchen. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to guide me down the hall. The kitchen was a mess. Every cupboard door hung open, dishes scattered across the floor. The air felt colder here, heavy with something I couldn't name. "What the hell?" I whispered, my breath visible in the freezing air. Before I could process it, the door to the pantry slammed shut. Hard. I didn't scream, I couldn't. My voice caught in my throat as I stared at the door, my feet rooted to the spot. Slowly, I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. "Hello?" I whispered again, my voice barely audible. The silence on the other side was deafening. I yanked the door open, my flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. Nothing. Just shelves lined with canned goods and cleaning supplies. I stepped back, my mind racing. "You're imagining things," I told myself. "You're tired, stressed. That's all." But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Lights flickered. Objects moved on their own, a coffee mug sliding across the counter, a chair scraping back from the dining table. At night, I heard footsteps pacing the hallway outside my bedroom, though the house was locked and empty. The worst part was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that I was being watched. Wherever I went in the house, it followed me, an oppressive weight pressing against my chest. One evening, desperate for answers, I set up my phone to record the living room while I slept. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. At exactly 3 a.m, the chandelier began to sway. Slowly at first, then violently, as though something unseen was shaking it. Books flew off the shelves, one by one, and the sofa slid several inches across the floor. And then, a shadow appeared. It moved across the frame, tall and humanoid, but wrong, its movements jerky, unnatural. It stopped in front of the camera, and for a moment, I thought it was staring directly at me. The screen went black. I packed a bag that afternoon and left the house, my heart pounding as I locked the door behind me. I didn't care about the lease, the money I'd sunk into the place. Whatever was in that house could have it. The Demon in the Notebook. The Notebook was an impulse buy. I had spotted it at a dusty second-hand shop on my way home from work. Its leather cover was intricately detailed, etched with swirling patterns that seemed almost alive. The pages inside were blank, the edges slightly yellowed, as though waiting for stories to be written. I loved notebooks. They made me feel organized, creative, like my chaotic thoughts could be tamed within their pages. This one felt special, like it had chosen me. I brought it home, set it on the coffee table, and admired it for a moment before flipping it open. The faint scent of old paper wafted up, mingling with the aroma of my coffee. I grabbed a pen and wrote my name on the first page, Eleanor Harper. The pen moved smoothly, as if the paper welcomed the ink. I smiled. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the notebook. I didn't know why. It was just a notebook, after all. But something about it lingered in my mind. When I opened it the next morning, I froze. There, beneath my name, were words I hadn't written. "I've been waiting for you." I stared at the page, my heart racing. The ink was faint, the letters slightly uneven, as if written by an unsteady hand. Did I do this and forget? I muttered, though I knew I hadn't. I shook my head and closed the notebook, shoving it into a drawer. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe the shopkeeper had done it as a joke. I told myself it didn't matter. But that night, I dreamt of the notebook. In the dream, it lay open on my desk, its pages flipping wildly as if caught in a storm. Dark figures swirled around it, whispering in a language I didn't understand. When I woke, drenched in sweat, I couldn't bring myself to check the drawer. By the third day, I couldn't resist. I pulled the notebook out and flipped it open. The page was blank. My name was still there, but the strange message was gone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "See?" I said aloud. "You're overreacting." But then, the letters began to form. I watched, frozen, as ink seeped onto the page as though an invisible hand was writing. The words appeared slowly, deliberately. "Help me." My pulse thundered in my ears. The pen was on the desk beside me, untouched. My hand shook as I grabbed the notebook, slamming it shut. "I'm losing my mind," I whispered. But when I tried to throw the notebook away, my body wouldn't let me. I gripped it tightly, my fingers refusing to let go. The compulsion was overwhelming, as if the notebook was tethered to me. That night, the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible over the hum of my bedside fan. But as the hours dragged on, they grew louder, more insistent. I turned on every light in the apartment, clutching the notebook. Its cover felt warm, almost pulsing beneath my fingers. The whispers formed words, "Write." "No," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "Write," they repeated, louder now. The pen rolled across the table, stopping beside my hand. My fingers moved on their own, picking it up. My body wasn't mine anymore, controlled by something unseen. The first words spilled onto the page before I could stop it. "Yes." The room darkened. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching toward me. The air turned heavy, thick with the scent of burnt wood. The notebook's pages flipped wildly again, stopping on one near the middle. The words that appeared made my blood run cold. "You agreed. You're mine now." I screamed, throwing the notebook across the room. It hit the wall and fell open, the pages blank again, mocking me. The whispers didn't stop after that. Neither did the dreams. The notebook stays with me, no matter how many times I try to leave it behind. And now, as I write this, it's happening again. The words are forming on the page, but they're not mine. Tell them I'm coming. The monster in the bathroom. The bathroom always felt colder than the rest of the apartment. It wasn't an old place, modern, clean lines, gleaming tiles, but that room had a chill that never went away. I tried to ignore it, blaming bad insulation. But it wasn't just the cold. It was the way the mirror seemed to fog up even when I hadn't used the shower. The way the drain gurgled late at night, as if something was moving inside. It started small, like these things always do. One night, as I brushed my teeth, I noticed the faint sound of dripping water. I glanced at the faucet, but it was off. The sound seemed to come from the shower. I pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The tiles were dry, the shower head perfectly still. Probably the pipes, I muttered, though my chest felt tight. I finished up quickly, avoiding my reflection in the mirror. Something about it unsettled me, the way the light flickered slightly, casting odd shadows across my face. The next night, the dripping returned. Louder this time. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The sound seemed to echo, filling the small bathroom with a maddening rhythm. Drip. 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 I yanked back the shower curtain, ready to find the source. And there it was. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow, maybe. But no, it was darker than any shadow I'd ever seen, a thick, writhing mass that clung to the drain. It pulsed, shifting slightly as if alive. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the slick tiles. The thing in the drain didn't move toward me. It stayed there, growing, the darkness spreading outward like spilled ink. I grabbed the mop from the corner and jabbed it at the drain, my heart pounding. The moment the stick touched the mass, the sound stopped. The darkness retreated, shrinking back into the metal ring until it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself it hadn't happened. Stress, exhaustion, anything but what I'd seen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the fourth night, I was terrified to step into the bathroom. The dripping had turned into a steady trickle, no matter how tightly I turned the knobs. The drain gurgled constantly now, as if something was trying to crawl out. I decided to face it head on. Armed with a flashlight and the longest kitchen knife I owned, I stood in the doorway, staring at the drain. The sound stopped the moment I entered, replaced by silence so absolute it felt suffocating. Slowly, I moved toward the shower, my feet dragging as if weighted. The drain was open, wider than it should have been, the edges cracked and uneven. A faint, sour smell wafted up, making my stomach turn. Then I saw it. A hand. It wasn't human, its skin was slick and gray, its fingers long and ending in sharp, black tips. It gripped the edge of the drain, pulling something up with it. I froze, my body locked in place as the thing emerged. Its head was wrong, too wide and too flat, with two deep-set eyes that reflected the faint light. Its mouth stretched open, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It let out a sound, a low, wet gurgle that sent a shiver down my spine. I screamed, finally breaking free of my paralysis. I ran, slamming the bathroom door shut behind me. The gurgling grew louder, joined by a scraping sound as if it was clawing at the other side of the door. The lights flickered throughout the apartment, plunging me into darkness for a split second before coming back on. I didn't stay to see if the door would hold. I grabbed my keys and bolted, the sound of the monsters gurgling following me all the way down the hallway. I haven't gone back since. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it dripping water, faint and steady, as if it's still waiting for me. The ghost in the mine. The abandoned mine wasn't on any map. I had only stumbled across it during a hike, chasing the last light of the setting sun through the hills. It was tucked away in a gully, a weathered wooden frame marking the entrance. A sign hung crookedly above it, the words Black Hollow Mine, do not enter, barely visible beneath layers of dirt and rust. Something about it drew me in. Maybe it was the stillness, the way the wind seemed to hush as I approached. Or maybe it was the faint whisper I thought I heard, so soft it could have been the wind through the trees. I should have turned back. But curiosity got the better of me. I ducked inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of wet stone and something faintly metallic. The tunnel sloped downward, the wooden beams holding the walls in place creaking softly. My footsteps echoed, each one sounding louder than the last. About 50 steps in, I noticed the first sign of trouble, a faint smear of red on the ground, like something had been dragged. My pulse quickened. Just rust, I whispered to myself, but I knew it wasn't true. I pressed on. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, the walls glinting faintly with mineral deposits. Old tools were scattered around, pickaxes, shovels, a rusted wheelbarrow tipped on its side. And then, I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the chamber, half shrouded in shadows. At first, I thought it was a miner. His clothes were old-fashioned, covered in grime, and he wore a hard hat that gleamed faintly in the beam of my flashlight. But there was something wrong with him. His outline shimmered, as though he weren't fully there, and his face was blurred, like an out-of-focus photograph. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't move. I stepped closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Are you?" Before I could finish, he turned. The motion was jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. His head tilted at an impossible angle, and a sound filled the chamber, a low, guttural moan that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then he vanished. Not into the shadows, not into another tunnel. He simply disappeared, leaving the chamber colder than before. The moan turned into a whisper, echoing all around me. "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the dirt floor. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with every step. The whispers followed me, growing louder, overlapping until they were a chorus of voices, each one more desperate than the last. "You shouldn't be here. You can't escape. He'll find you." I reached the entrance just as the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, glancing back to see the figure again, closer this time, his blurred face turned toward me, empty sockets where his eyes should have been. The whispers turned into a deafening roar as I threw myself out of the mine, collapsing onto the dirt outside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the noise stopped. I lay there, gasping for breath, the stillness pressing down on me like a weight. When I finally dared to look back, the entrance was dark, silent. But as I scrambled to my feet and backed away, I saw a faint shimmer in the shadows. A figure, watching me from the darkness, just beyond the threshold. I ran and never looked back. Grandmother's house. It had been years since I visited grandmother. She used to be warm, gentle, the kind of person who always had cookies baking and a hand-knit blanket waiting. But something changed after Grandfather passed. Mom said she stopped answering the phone, started talking to herself, and refused any visitors. When Mom begged me to check on her, I couldn't say no. Grandmother's house was on the edge of town, an old colonial with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The overgrown yard and darkened windows made it seem more like a haunted relic than the cozy home I remembered. I knocked twice on the heavy oak door, the sound echoing in the quiet evening. "Grandma?" "It's me, Emma," I called out. No response. I tried the handle, it was unlocked. The smell hit me first. Stale air mixed with something sour, like spoiled milk. The hallway was dim, the old wallpaper peeling in long strips. "Grandma?" I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The lock clicked loudly, and the sound made me flinch. The living room was worse. Furniture was overturned, piles of papers scattered everywhere. The curtains were drawn tight, shutting out what little daylight remained. A faint sound carried from the back of the house, a rhythmic creaking like an old rocking chair. "Grandma, are you okay?" My voice felt too loud in the oppressive silence. I followed the noise, my footsteps crunching over something brittle. Glass? I didn't look down. The kitchen was empty but bore the same signs of disarray. Plates and cups piled high in the sink, dried food crusted on the counters. A single candle burned on the table, its flickering flame casting jagged shadows on the walls. "Emma!" The voice came from upstairs. I froze. It sounded like her, but off somehow, too sharp, too deliberate. "Grandma?" I called, my voice cracking. "Come up, dear." The words were slow, drawn out, each syllable dripping with something I couldn't place. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't. She was family. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, the creaking growing louder with each step. The hallway at the top was even darker, the air colder. "Grandma?" I tried again. "In here." Her voice came from the bedroom at the end of the hall. I pushed the door open. She sat in a rocking chair by the window, the same one she'd had for decades. The curtains were drawn, the room lit only by the faint glow of a single lamp. She was facing away from me, her frail frame barely visible beneath a shawl. "Grandma, it's Emma," I said, stepping closer. She didn't respond. The chair rocked slowly, creaking with each movement. "Are you okay?" "Mom's been worried." Still no answer. I moved around to face her, my heart pounding. When I saw her, I nearly screamed. Her face was wrong, her skin stretched too tight, her eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles. But it was her mouth that terrified me most. It was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin, her teeth bared in a way that looked painful. "Emma," she said, her voice a low rasp. "Grandma, what's going on?" I whispered, backing away. Her head tilted sharply, the grin never faltering. "He said you'd come." "Who?" Her hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with a strength that didn't match her frail appearance. Her skin was ice cold. "Don't let him in," she hissed, the grin faltering for a moment. "Don't let him in." "Let who in?" I yanked my arm free, stumbling backward. She laughed then, a horrible, guttural sound that didn't belong in her small body. The rocking chair creaked faster, her body moving with it in unnatural jerks. I bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door, not stopping until I reached my car. When I finally dared to look back, the house was dark again, silent and still. But in the upstairs window, I thought I saw her silhouette, watching me with that same twisted grin. I haven't gone back. The Witch Next Door. When Mrs. Willoughby moved into the house next door, the whole neighborhood whispered about her. She wasn't like anyone else on the street. No kids, no husband, just an ancient sedan and even older cat with matted black fur. She dressed in long skirts, always black, and wore wide-brimmed hats that shadowed her face. Her yard was an overgrown jumble of wildflowers, weeds, and strange, twisting vines that seemed to grow overnight. People joked about her being a witch, but no one really believed it. Not until things started happening. It began with small things, dead birds on driveways, pets going missing, the air feeling heavy around her house. People avoided her. I would have too, but her backyard butted up to mine, and she'd sometimes appear when I was outside. "Lovely evening," she'd say, her voice soft but carrying an edge, like a blade wrapped in velvet. I'd nod awkwardly, avoiding her piercing gaze. Her eyes were green, too green, like they glowed in the twilight. One night, while I was sitting on my porch, I heard a strange sound coming from her yard. A low humming, almost like chanting. The curtains in her window were drawn, but faint light flickered behind them, casting odd shapes. I leaned closer, trying to see, but then her shadow appeared, tall, thin, and somehow wrong. It stretched unnaturally across the room, twisting as if it had a life of its own. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light. But the feeling wouldn't leave me. It got worse when I started hearing footsteps outside my window at night. I live alone, and my bedroom faces the side of her house. The first time I heard them, I thought it was an animal. But when I peeked out, I saw nothing, just the silhouette of her house, dark and looming. The second time, I saw her. She was standing in her yard, staring at my window. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her face obscured by the brim of her hat. My heart raced as I ducked out of sight, too terrified to confront her. The next morning, I found something on my doorstep, a bundle of sticks tied with red string and a small, black feather tucked into the knot. I should have thrown it away, but I was too afraid. I left it there, hoping she'd take it back. That night, the footsteps came again, louder this time. And then, the whispering started. It wasn't just outside, it was inside, faint and low, like someone murmuring right behind me. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered. I ran to the living room, grabbing my phone to call someone, anyone. But the moment I unlocked it, the screen went black, and a sharp knock echoed through the house. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The knocking came again, louder, as if whoever it was knew I was there. I crept to the door, peering through the peephole. It was her. She stood on my porch, holding the bundle of sticks. Her head tilted slightly, and that too green gaze bore into mine, even through the tiny glass lens. "You forgot this," she said, her voice calm but chilling. I didn't open the door. "I'll leave it here," she continued, placing the bundle back on the step. Her hand lingered on the doorframe, her nails too long and sharp. "Don't forget again." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of her yard. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers came back, louder than before, filling every corner of the house. And when I finally dared to look outside, Her windows were glowing faintly, her shadow moving unnaturally behind the curtains. I haven't seen her since, but every time I step outside, I feel her eyes on me, watching. Something beneath the lake. I grew up by the lake, the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the water is as familiar as the back of your hand. I spent my childhood summers swimming, fishing, and diving into the cool depths, always feeling safe and at home. But something changed when I returned after years away, drawn back by the passing of my father and the need to close up the family cabin. The lake was quieter than I remembered. The usual chatter of fishermen was gone, and the summer cottages seemed abandoned. The water was still, the surface smooth and unbroken, reflecting the gray sky above like a sheet of glass. It was the first evening that the odd feeling began. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the water, I heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something knocking beneath the surface. I brushed it off as fish or the wind playing tricks with the waves. But that night, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It wasn't the usual peace the lake gave me. It felt heavy, like something was waiting. The next day, I took my boat out. The sky was clear and the water shimmered under the sun's rays. But as I rode deeper into the middle of the lake, the air grew thick with humidity, the silence pressing down on me. The tapping began again, louder this time. I stopped rowing, the boat rocking slightly. It came from below me, a steady rhythm, like something large and deliberate. I leaned over the edge, squinting into the water. The surface was calm, but I could feel it. Something was down there, just beyond my reach, something massive and shifting. The temperature dropped around me, and a chill crept up my spine. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw Ripple. A dark shape moving beneath the water, too large to be a fish. I grabbed the oars and began to row back to the shore, panic rising in my chest. The ripple grew larger, following the boat, circling beneath me as if it were toying with me. The tapping grew louder, the sound almost in rhythm with my frantic strokes. By the time I reached the shore, the water seemed to calm again, the strange presence receding as though it had never been there. But the feeling lingered, like something was still watching from beneath. That night, I couldn't sleep. The shadows outside my window seemed to move, and the distant sound of tapping came again, carried on the wind. I thought I was imagining things until I went back to the cabin the next morning and saw the water had receded slightly overnight, revealing something just beneath the surface, a large, twisted shape, half buried in the muck. I waded in, the cold water creeping up my legs as I approached it. The shape was far bigger than I expected. It was a tangled mess of old wooden beams and metal, some sort of wreckage, with deep scratches running along the sides. But it wasn't the wreckage that froze me in place, it was the fact that it was moving, very slowly, as if it were alive. A voice inside me screamed to run, to turn away, but I couldn't. Then, the water broke. A shape, dark and sleek, rose from beneath the surface, a long, twisted figure with glowing, yellow eyes. Its body was a mass of scales and broken limbs, something that no fish should be. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. The thing didn't follow me, but its eyes were fixed on mine, unblinking, unyielding. I turned and ran, slipping in the muck as I made it back to the cabin. I didn't stop until I was locked inside, staring at the lake from the safety of the porch. The tapping never stopped. I left the lake the next morning, and I haven't been back since. But sometimes, when the wind picks up, I can still hear it, faint tapping, coming from the depths, calling me back to the water. The toy that moved. It started with a gift. I was 9 years old when my grandmother gave me a small, hand-carved wooden doll. It had bright, painted eyes, a little dress made of faded fabric, and hair made from what looked like yarn. She told me it was special, a family heirloom passed down for generations, but there was something in her eyes as she handed it to me, a hint of unease I didn't understand at the time. I placed it on my shelf, among my other toys, never giving it much thought until the first night it happened. I woke up to a soft sound, scraping, like wood moving against wood. I blinked, confused, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. Then I heard it again, the faint sound of something being dragged across my shelf. I turned toward the shelf. The doll was gone. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, but I could see it clearly now. The doll was standing at the edge of the shelf, facing the bed. It wasn't just sitting there, it was standing, perfectly still. I rubbed my eyes, unsure if I was still dreaming, but the sight didn't change. The doll's painted eyes seemed to glisten in the moonlight, and I could almost swear it was looking right at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. And then, in the dead of night, the doll took a step. It moved on its own, its little wooden feet scraping across the shelf as it shifted slightly, its head turning ever so slightly to the left, as if it were looking toward the door. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared, frozen in place. The next morning, I told my parents. They dismissed it as a bad dream, chalking it up to my imagination. But that night, I kept my eyes on the shelf, unwilling to turn away. And sure enough, when the room fell silent, the scraping returned. The doll was moving again. This time, it took 2 steps, each one deliberate, each one louder. The sound of its wooden feet scraping on the shelf echoed in the stillness of the room. I couldn't bring myself to look away, watching in terrified fascination as it slowly inched toward the edge of the shelf. I grabbed it. I didn't think, I just reached out and snatched it up, holding it tightly in my hands. It felt cold, too cold for something made of wood. I tossed it into the closet, locking the door behind it, praying that would end it. But the next day, when I opened the door to the closet, the doll was sitting on the floor, its painted eyes staring up at me. No matter how many times I locked it away, the doll kept returning, always in the same spot, always waiting. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind, "It's special, dear. It chooses who it stays with." I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to get rid of it. I wrapped the doll in an old blanket and threw it in the trash, hoping that would be the end of it. That night, I slept soundly, for the first time in weeks. But the next morning, when I went outside, I saw it. The doll was sitting on my porch, its eyes staring at me from the wooden steps, its little dress fluttering in the breeze. It had come back. I don't know what it wants, or why it won't leave me. But I can't escape it. Every time I move, it follows me. No matter where I go, it's always there, waiting, watching. I can still hear the soft scraping, the slow movement, just behind me. The Vampire of the Hangman. I've never been a superstitious person. I've heard all the old stories, the vampire myths, the dark legends whispered by people who swear they've seen things that go bump in the night. I thought they were just that, stories. That was until I found the house. I had been traveling through the mountains, looking for a quiet place to stay for a few nights. After a long drive, I saw it, an old, crumbling mansion at the end of a narrow road. The kind of house that looked abandoned, but not quite. Its windows were dark, the shutters sagging from disuse, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds and thistles. But something about it called to me. I knocked on the door, half expecting no answer, but after a long pause, the door creaked open. A man stood there, thin and pale, with dark, sunken eyes. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, and wore an old-fashioned suit that seemed out of place for the time. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said, "but I was wondering if you'd be willing to rent me a room for the night. I'm traveling in." "You may stay," he interrupted, his voice deep and cold. "But you must follow my rules." I was about to ask what those rules were, but before I could speak, he stepped aside to let me in. The inside of the house was a maze of dimly lit hallways, filled with shadows that seemed to shift as I moved. The air was thick, stale with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic, like blood. The man led me up the stairs to a room at the far end of the hall. The door creaked open, revealing a simple bed, an antique dresser, and a small window that barely let in any light. It was cold, colder than it should have been. "You will stay here. No matter what you hear, do not open this door," the man warned, his eyes glinting with something dark. I nodded, but my curiosity gnawed at me. I wasn't sure what kind of game he was playing, but I didn't want to make waves. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the sounds. At first, they were faint or rustling, like footsteps in the hallway. Then, the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floor. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it, listening. A voice whispered from the other side. It was low, almost inaudible, but unmistakably urgent. "Don't open the door. He's coming." The voice was familiar, though I couldn't place it. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. My mind was spinning, wondering what was happening. Was it a prank? Or was something really wrong here? Then, the door handle turned. I froze, heart in my throat. The door creaked as if someone was about to push it open, but I could hear the man's voice from the other side, speaking to whoever, or whatever, was out there. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice no longer cold but filled with a low, terrifying command. "Not yet. Not tonight." I heard the heavy sound of footsteps retreating. I didn't move until the house was silent once more, but my skin felt like it was crawling. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat by the window, staring into the dark, listening for any sound, any movement. The next morning, I gathered my things to leave, but the man was gone. The house felt emptier now, like something had changed. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. Hanging from the branches of a nearby tree was a figure. It was a man, or at least it had once been. His body hung limp, his face twisted in agony, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right at me. His skin was ashen, pale and stretched tight against his bones. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and blood, dried and dark, stained his clothes. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. I recognized him. He was the man who had let me in. I ran, my legs heavy with fear, not daring to look back. I don't know what happened to him, or why he was hanging there like that. But I know one thing for certain, he wasn't alive when he opened that door to let me in. And whatever he was, whatever had turned him into that, it was still out there, waiting. the flower that attracted monsters. It was my grandmother who told me the legend of the flower. She was always full of strange stories, but this one stuck with me. It was about a flower that bloomed only once a year in the darkest corners of the forest. Its petals were dark red, almost black, and it emitted a fragrance so sweet it could drive anyone mad with desire. But there was a warning: if you plucked the flower, you invited something unnatural into your world. I thought it was just another of her old tales, but one summer, as I was wandering through the woods near our cabin, I saw it. The flower. It was growing in the shade of a massive oak tree, hidden beneath a veil of thick vines. Its petals were as dark as the night sky, and its scent was intoxicating, like honey mixed with something darker, something I couldn't quite place. Despite the warning echoing in my mind, I couldn't help myself. I reached out, drawn to it as though it were pulling me closer. The moment my fingers touched its stem, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I thought nothing of it until I heard the rustle in the bushes behind me. I turned, expecting to see a deer or some other forest creature, but what I saw made my blood run cold. A figure was standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, with skin like rotting bark, and eyes that gleamed a sickly yellow. It didn't move at first, but I felt its presence pressing down on me, like the air had grown heavier. The figure stepped forward, its form shifting in and out of focus, like it couldn't quite hold its shape. Its limbs were unnaturally long, twisted and clawed, and it had a face, a grotesque, misshapen face that seemed to stretch and distort with every blink. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away, but the thing didn't advance. It simply stood there, watching me. I remembered the flower then, the one I had plucked, and in that moment, I realized what I had done. I had invited it. The ground beneath my feet trembled as more figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms flickering like phantoms. They were all different, each one more horrifying than the last, monsters with sharp teeth, grotesque features, and eyes that burned with a hunger I couldn't understand. The one closest to me took a slow step forward, its yellow eyes locked onto mine. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth that dripped with something dark and viscous. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop to catch my breath. My mind raced, and my body moved on pure instinct as I pushed through the underbrush, the scent of the flower still clinging to the air. The monsters followed, their movements swift and unnatural, like shadows darting between trees. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin. My hands were shaking as I slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it with everything I had. The house was silent, but I could hear them outside, the faint sounds of scraping claws against wood, of something trying to get in. I don't know how long I sat there, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the inevitable. But the sounds eventually stopped. The monsters didn't come in, at least not yet. I still don't know what they were or why they followed me. But I've learned one thing: the flower calls to them, and once you answer, there's no turning back. I've since left the cabin, moved far away from those woods, but sometimes, when the night is still and the air thick with that same sweet scent, I hear it. A faint rustling outside my window, a scraping sound just beyond the glass, and I know they're still waiting. The pursuer. I didn't notice him at first. That's the thing about being watched, you don't always see it until it's too late. It started when I moved to the city. A fresh start, a chance to leave behind the past. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts, a place that was quiet and empty enough for me to think, to breathe. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, getting settled, and adjusting to the rhythm of a new life. But then it happened. I was walking home from the grocery store one evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange. I was almost at my building when I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. A sense that someone was close, too close, but I couldn't see them. I turned quickly, scanning the street. Nothing. Just the usual, cars parked along the curb, people walking by, the hum of the city's late-night life. But as I turned back toward the entrance of the building, I saw him. He was standing across the street, just outside the shadows of a tree, watching me. I froze. His face was partially obscured by the darkness, but his eyes, those eyes, were unmistakable. Dark, intense, and far too focused on me. He wasn't just looking at me, he was studying me. I quickly walked into the building, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But the next day, as I was walking to the bus stop, I saw him again. This time, he was closer, standing in the doorway of a convenience store, his eyes locked on mine. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, avoiding his gaze, but I could feel him following me, his presence like a weight on my shoulders. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just coincidence. But each day, I saw him more and more across the street, lurking in alleyways, always a step behind me. No matter where I went, he was there. And every time, he was watching. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. But then, the notes started appearing. At first, they were small, folded pieces of paper left on my doorstep. A simple phrase, scribbled in uneven handwriting, "I'm coming for you." I threw them away, thinking it was some sick joke. But the next day, another note, this time slipped under my door, "You can't run from me." And then, the phone calls. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of my phone ringing. When I picked up, no one was there, just the sound of shallow breathing. At first, I thought it was a wrong number, a prank. But then I started hearing whispers, soft and barely audible, like someone was speaking just out of reach, saying things I couldn't quite understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer. One night, I decided to confront him. I wasn't going to let this maniac control my life. I waited for him to appear, standing by the corner of the street where I had seen him most often. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the pavement. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. And then, there he was. He stepped out from the shadows, his face now clear in the dim light. It was him, the man who had been following me. His eyes were empty, hollow, like they were too deep to be human. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, staring at me. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and smooth, like silk scraping against skin. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. "Who are you?" His lips curled into a twisted smile. "It doesn't matter. I'm here now." I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't dare look back. I don't know how long I ran, or how far, but when I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I was alone. There was no sign of him. But I know he's still out there. I can feel him watching me, even now, as I sit here writing this. I can feel his eyes on me, like a weight pressing against my chest. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, he will always be there. Always just behind me, always waiting. The pursuer is never far behind. the strange behavior of my parents. It was the little things at first. My parents were always quiet people, distant, but loving in their own way. They'd raised me in a small, tidy house in a sleepy neighborhood, and while things were never overly affectionate, they were stable. I was used to their routines, Dad getting up at dawn to work in the garage, Mom tending to the garden, her soft humming filling the house. Everything in its place, everything in its time. But then something started to change. It began on a Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. It didn't matter. What mattered was when I came home from school and found the front door unlocked, wide open, in fact. I don't recall it ever being left like that before. I stepped inside, my school bag heavy on my back, and called out for them. Mom? Dad? The house was eerily silent. I walked into the living room and found my father sitting on the couch. He was staring blankly at the television, which wasn't on. The room felt colder than it should have, the air thick with stillness. Dad? I asked again, a little more uneasy this time. What are you doing? He didn't respond at first, his gaze still locked on the empty screen. His fingers twitched on the armrest, as if he were adjusting to something, but his eyes never moved. Dad? I repeated, louder this time. Are you okay? Finally, he blinked, but it seemed like a delayed reaction, as though he hadn't heard me at all. Slowly, he turned to face me, his eyes vacant, like there was no recognition in them. I'm fine, he said, his voice low and calm, but it didn't sound like him. There was no warmth in his tone. Just flatness. I didn't know what to say. It was so unlike him. He was always so alert, so engaged with everything. This wasn't him. I tried to shake it off as some kind of momentary lapse, maybe fatigue or stress. But the next morning, things got worse. Mom didn't cook breakfast. Now, that might not sound strange, but it was. Mom always made breakfast. Pancakes on Saturdays, eggs and toast on weekdays. But this morning, the kitchen was empty, the stove cold, the air still. Mom? I called out, but there was no answer. I found her in the study, sitting at the desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was staring at the wall, her eyes wide, unblinking. Mom? I approached her, my voice shaking. Are you okay? She didn't respond, but I noticed that her lips were moving, whispering something, though it was so soft I couldn't make it out. I bent closer to her. Mom, what are you saying? Her head snapped around so suddenly that it made me jump. Her eyes were wide, unseeing, and her lips curled into a strange, almost eerie smile. I'm fine, sweetheart, she said, but it was like she wasn't speaking to me at all. Everything is fine. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine. Something was wrong. Over the following days, it got worse. My father started to forget things. He'd walk into a room and forget why he was there. He'd sit in the dark, staring out of the window for hours, without saying a word. When I tried to talk to him, he'd give me that same blank stare, as if he didn't recognize me. Mom's behavior wasn't any better. She started to act distant, like she wasn't really there. She'd prepare dinner but forget to serve it, leaving the pots and pans on the stove to burn. When I asked her to help me with my homework, she'd stare at the paper, unblinking, her mind lost in some far-off place. It wasn't long before I couldn't stand it anymore. I called my aunt, asking her to come over, to talk to them, to help. But when she arrived, she said nothing was wrong. They're fine, she told me, her voice soft, but her eyes were clouded with something I couldn't place. No, I said, my voice breaking. They're not fine. They're not themselves. Something's wrong with them, Aunt Margaret. Something's wrong. But she didn't listen. She just smiled and patted my hand, like I was overreacting, like I was imagining things. The next day, I came home to find the house completely different. The furniture had been moved. The photos on the walls were rearranged, as though they didn't belong to us anymore. I went into the living room to find both my parents sitting on the couch. They were perfectly still, staring ahead, unblinking. When I spoke to them, they didn't respond. They didn't even acknowledge me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I realized then that they weren't my parents anymore. They had become strangers. I don't know what happened to them or what I walked into, but I do know that I've never been able to leave them behind. I moved out, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, I feel their presence watching me, waiting for me to come back. The mirror in the attic. It was just supposed to be a weekend getaway, something simple to get away from the noise of city life. I rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, tucked away near a dense forest. The place was older, a bit weathered, but charming in its own way. The kind of house you'd find in a storybook, with creaky floors and ivy crawling up the walls. The first night was calm. The wind howled outside, but inside it was warm and cozy. I unpacked, settled in with a book, and let the crackling fire lull me into a sense of peace. But as the hours passed, I started noticing something strange. The mirror. It was an antique, large enough to take up one wall of the attic, its frame carved with intricate designs that looked older than the house itself. It didn't stand out much at first, hidden in the dim corner of the attic. But when I climbed up there the next morning to explore, something about it caught my attention. At first, it was just a reflection. It didn't seem quite right, distorted, almost like the mirror was hiding something behind its surface. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just an old piece of furniture with a tarnished glass. But that evening, as I climbed the stairs again, the attic felt different, thick with tension, as though something had changed in the air. I approached the mirror carefully, my heart beginning to race. It was almost like I could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing on me. I studied my reflection, but something was off. My face in the glass was too pale, too drawn, and my eyes seemed hollow. I stepped back. Then, I saw it. In the reflection, behind me, there was a shadow, dark, moving, though nothing was there when I turned around. I took a step toward the attic door, my hands trembling, but when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was clearer now, no longer a vague blur, but a figure. It was a person. A woman. Her features were distorted, but I could make out her long, tangled hair and the dark, empty space where her eyes should be. She was watching me, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. I didn't know what to do, whether to scream or run. I just stared at the mirror, paralyzed. The air felt colder now, and the room seemed to close in around me. I could hear her, faint whispers in the air, like she was trying to speak, but the words were unintelligible. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, but the room behind me was empty. The attic was quiet, nothing out of place. I backed away from the mirror, stumbling toward the stairs, but the whispering grew louder. It was coming from the reflection, from the woman who wasn't supposed to be there. She was moving now, her form stretching and contorting, the glass distorting as though she were trying to push through. The moment my foot hit the bottom step, the whispering stopped. I waited, breath held, but the house was silent again. I didn't go back up into the attic. I couldn't. I left the cottage early the next morning, too shaken to stay another night. As I drove away, I kept thinking about the mirror, the reflection of the woman who wasn't there, the way she seemed to be waiting for me to come back. I never went back to that cottage. And I never looked in a mirror the same way again. The voice behind the wall. It was supposed to be a simple house renovation. Nothing too major, just some painting and reworking the plumbing in the old Victorian house I had inherited from my aunt. It was an imposing place, with its dark wood paneling and faded wallpaper, but I saw potential in it. The workmen had come in early, and I was excited to make this place feel like home. The first few days were filled with the usual mess of construction, dust, the sound of hammering, pipes being replaced. But something began to shift when I started on the upstairs rooms. There was a bedroom I hadn't intended to touch, a small one tucked in the back of the house, next to the attic. It was mostly unused, except for the occasional storage of old things. I decided to clean it out, to see what I was working with. The moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The air was colder, heavier. The room was cluttered with old furniture covered in dusty sheets. But what struck me most was the wall. There was a strange indentation in the far corner, as if something had been pressed against it for years. It looked almost like a door frame, though there was no door. The wood was warped, aged in a way that didn't match the rest of the house. I pressed my hand against it, and the wall was unnervingly cold to the touch. Curious, I decided to take the drywall down. The workmen had left for the day, and I thought it would be a simple project, just remove some of the wood to see what was behind. But as I began to peel back the layers, a sound came from the wall. It was soft at first, just a scratching noise, like nails running along wood. I froze. The sound stopped, and for a moment, the room was completely silent. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, wondering if I was hearing things. But then, again, a voice. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Help me." I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I wasn't alone in this house. There was someone, or something, behind the wall. The air grew colder, and the whispers seemed to come from all around me, as if it was pressing in on me from every corner. I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but my hand was shaking too much to dial. The whispering continued, louder now, more frantic. "Help me, please." The voice wasn't human. It was wrong, distorted, as if it had been trapped for a long time. The words seemed to echo inside my head, pushing against my thoughts. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran down the stairs, slamming the door behind me. The house seemed to grow darker, the shadows pressing in around me, suffocating me. I didn't care about the renovation anymore. The voice lingered even as I left the house and sat in my car, too afraid to go back. The whispers continued to haunt me in the days that followed, echoing through my mind, always saying the same thing, "Help me." I called a contractor the next morning to seal up the wall. They were puzzled, but they didn't hear anything when they came to look. Of course, they didn't. The house is still standing, but I can't bring myself to go near it. I visit only when I must, to check on things, but every time I pass by, I hear it. The voice. The whispers. "Help me." The stranger in the library. It was just supposed to be an afternoon in a quiet library, a place where I could escape the chaos of my day. I'd been coming to this library for weeks, working on a research paper for school. The smell of old books and the soft hum of fluorescent lights were calming, even if the place felt a little too empty. It wasn't a popular library, no crowds, no noise, just rows of bookshelves and the faint sound of pages turning. I was seated at my usual spot by the back window, my laptop open in front of me. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long, slanted shadows across the hardwood floor. It was peaceful, the kind of atmosphere that made it easy to lose track of time. But then I noticed him. At first, I thought it was just a fleeting glance, some shadow in my peripheral vision. But as I looked up, I saw a man sitting across the room from me, tucked away behind a row of bookshelves. He was staring at me. I froze. His eyes weren't the kind you could ignore, cold, empty, almost hollow. It was as if he were studying me, as though I wasn't just some random person in a library, but the subject of his focus. I tried to shake it off, focusing back on my work, but every few minutes, I would glance up, and he would still be there. The man didn't move. He didn't read a book, didn't make a sound. He just watched. The unease crept into my chest, my fingers growing stiff on the keyboard. I tried to pretend it wasn't happening, telling myself it was all in my head. But when I turned to glance up again, something had changed. The man was standing. Not walking, not moving in any way that made sense. He was standing perfectly still, facing me, his eyes never leaving mine. He wasn't near any bookshelf or table, he was just standing there in the middle of the aisle, completely out of place. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my things, my bag, my papers, and stood up to leave. I tried not to look at him, but I couldn't stop myself. His face was still locked on me, his expression unreadable. As I stepped into the aisle, I glanced over at him one last time. He was gone. I froze in the middle of the aisle, my heart hammering. There was no sign of him anywhere. He hadn't passed by me, he hadn't moved, he was just gone. I didn't know whether to run or stay, whether to believe what I'd just seen. But I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and hurried out of the library, not daring to look back. The next day, I went back. I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But as I walked through the entrance, I saw something strange. The man's face was on a poster by the door. It was an old advertisement for a local event, but there was no mistaking it. His cold, empty eyes were staring back at me from the printed paper. I didn't stay to read more. I left, and I haven't gone back since. The Forgotten Door. I had just moved into a new apartment, excited to start fresh in a place of my own. It was an older building, one of those pre-war complexes that still had charm, even if the floors creaked and the walls were thin. My neighbors were quiet, and I spent most of my time unpacking, trying to make the space feel like home. But there was something strange about the apartment, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things that felt off. The temperature would drop unexpectedly in one room, the lights would flicker at odd hours, and there was always a faint smell of something musty, like wet wood. The weirdest thing, however, was a door I found in the hallway. It wasn't really a door, not in the way most doors are. It was set in the middle of the hallway, but there was no keyhole, no handle, no way to open it. Just an old, wooden frame, with peeling paint and a rusted lock that didn't seem to match the rest of the building. I couldn't remember seeing it when I first toured the apartment, but when I asked the landlord about it, he just shrugged. Old storage closet, he said, his voice a little too quick. Not much in there anymore. Doesn't get used. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But every time I passed that door, I felt an unsettling pull, as if something was drawing me toward it. There was a sense of history, something buried behind the wood that I wasn't supposed to know. One evening, I finally gave in. I had been pacing the hallway for hours, my curiosity getting the better of me. I went to the door, fingers trembling as I ran them along the edge, searching for some hidden latch, some way to open it. And then, just as I was about to give up, it happened. The door opened. It wasn't like a door opening normally. It didn't creak or swing gently on its hinges. It just opened. Behind it, there was no room, no hidden closet or secret chamber. Instead, it was just blackness. A deep, suffocating blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. The air that poured out from the darkness was thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I couldn't breathe. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost tangible. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I was paralyzed by the sheer nothingness that awaited me beyond the door. Then, without warning, I heard it. A whisper. It came from inside the darkness, low and soft at first, like a breeze. But the words were unmistakable. Come in. The whisper echoed in my head, and I felt my heart race, my legs finally able to move. I slammed the door shut and backed away, gasping for air. The hallway seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing until I could barely breathe. I didn't sleep that night. The door, now closed again, was a constant presence in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the whisper that had come from within the darkness. The next morning, I tried to tell myself I had imagined it, but when I went into the hallway, the door was gone. It was as if it had never been there. There was no trace of it, not a scratch on the wall, not a single mark to indicate its existence. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I can still feel the weight of that darkness, the pull of something that wanted me to step through. I haven't stayed in the apartment since. And I never will. The echo in the basement. When I first moved into my new house, everything seemed perfect. It was an old brick house on the outskirts of town, with a large backyard and a basement I figured I could turn into a cozy workspace. The walls were painted a faded cream, and the hardwood floors creaked underfoot in a comforting way. I loved the house immediately. It was peaceful, isolated, and I could already picture my life here, quiet mornings, nights with friends, and long afternoons in the garden. The basement, however, felt different. It wasn't the dank, musty air or the faint smell of mold, it was something more unsettling. The space itself was huge, stretching farther than I'd expected, with shelves of old jars and boxes scattered around. There was an old wood-burning stove tucked in one corner, and a narrow, steep staircase that led up into the house. But what caught my attention most was the echo. At first, I thought it was just the acoustics of the house. The old walls, the wooden stairs, the high ceilings. But after spending more time down there, I realized the echo was off. It wasn't just the usual reverberation of my footsteps or my voice. No, this echo was different. It felt like it was mimicking me, repeating things I hadn't said, or making noises I hadn't made. One night, I went down there to grab something I had left behind. As I entered the basement, the air felt heavier than usual, as though the space was holding its breath. I turned on the light, the single bulb flickering for a moment before illuminating the shelves of old, forgotten things. I took a few steps toward the back, but as I did, I heard it, soft at first, a faint whisper behind me. "Stay." I froze. My skin prickled, my heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. I was alone. Yet the air felt charged, thick with the sound of my own heartbeat. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside creeping through the cracks. But then, the echo came again. Only this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a voice, louder, clearer. "Don't leave." I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The basement was still empty, nothing had moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. I backed toward the stairs, my mind racing. The voice had been too real. Too clear. I had to get out of there. As I reached the stairs, something strange happened. The echo didn't follow me. Instead, it seemed to remain in the corner of the basement, lingering in the shadows. The longer I stood there, the more I realized it wasn't just my voice or footsteps being mimicked. It was something else, something watching, waiting. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. The moment I was upstairs, the house felt quieter, but there was an unease that settled into my bones. It was as though something was waiting, just beyond the walls, in the dark corners of the basement. The next morning, I called in a contractor to check the foundation, thinking there might be something wrong with the house. The basement seemed fine, nothing unusual at all. But when I went back down there, the echo was still there. I've since stopped going into the basement. I've blocked off the stairs, not because I'm afraid of what's there, but because I don't know if I want to find out. And every time I pass that door, I can still hear it, faint but unmistakable. "Stay." The ghost in the mirror. I never believed in ghosts. I'd always thought that people who claimed to see spirits were just imagining things, or worse, looking for attention. My life had always been grounded in logic, reason, and facts. So when I moved into an old apartment in the city, a charming but worn-down place with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors, I didn't give a second thought to any rumors I'd heard about its strange past. I was used to living in older buildings. This one, in particular, was cozy. It had that timeless feel to it, and although it was a little faded, it was perfect for me, quiet, secluded, and in a good location. I settled in quickly, unpacking my belongings and getting used to the sounds of the building settling at night. But it was the mirror in the hallway that first caught my attention. It wasn't an ordinary mirror. It was large, framed in dark wood, and had been hanging on the wall when I moved in. Its surface was slightly warped, like it had been old even when it was new, and it gave off a faint, eerie reflection. At first, I thought it was just the dim lighting in the hallway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with it. Every time I passed by, I would glance at my reflection in the glass. But there was something about the way it looked at me that made my skin crawl. The reflection seemed to linger just a second too long, as if it wasn't quite mine. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. One night, after a long day of work, I was walking down the hallway toward my bedroom. I paused in front of the mirror, looking at myself as I always did. But this time, something was different. There was a faint movement in the reflection. At first, I thought it was just the light playing tricks on me, but then I saw it clearly. My reflection blinked. But I didn't. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked with the mirror. My heart began to race, and I quickly stepped back, but the reflection didn't follow me. It stayed, staring back at me with eyes that weren't mine. It was a face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted, mocking grin that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I turned away, rushing to my room and slamming the door behind me, but the image of that grin haunted me. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to stay away from the mirror, but it felt as though something was calling me back to it, pulling me toward the hallway. When I finally worked up the courage to go back, the mirror was just as it had been, empty, with no sign of anything unusual. But then, I noticed something. A small, almost imperceptible crack ran down the surface of the glass. It hadn't been there the day before. Over the next few weeks, the crack grew, spreading across the mirror like a web. Each time I passed, the reflection would change, growing more distorted, more grotesque. The face in the glass began to move on its own, its eyes following me as I walked, its grin widening. I couldn't take it any longer. One night, I grabbed a hammer and smashed the mirror. The glass shattered into 1,000 pieces, the sound ringing in my ears. For a moment, I stood there, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was quiet. Empty. But then I saw it. A shard of the broken mirror on the floor. And in it, I could still see the face. It was staring at me, its grin twisted and mocking, as though it had been waiting for me to break the glass all along. I don't know what happened after that. I left the apartment the next morning and never went back. I moved far away, somewhere quiet, somewhere safe. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still feel those eyes watching me. I can never escape the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for me, trapped in the reflection of a broken mirror. The Beast in the Forest. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. A chance to escape the hustle of the city, get some fresh air, and clear my head. I found a small cabin on the edge of a dense forest, far enough from civilization to feel isolated, but close enough to a town that I wouldn't be completely cut off. The cabin was rustic, with creaky floorboards and a fireplace that seemed to have been used many times before. It felt peaceful, a perfect place to relax. But there was something about the forest surrounding it. The first day, I went for a hike. The weather was crisp, and the sun filtered through the canopy of trees, casting long, dappled shadows across the trail. I wasn't worried. It was just a normal forest, right? The kind of place people visit all the time to walk, to hike, to enjoy nature. But as I ventured deeper, something began to feel wrong. At first, it was just the silence. The forest was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My steps echoed louder than they should have, the air thick and heavy. The birds weren't singing, and there were no rustling sounds in the underbrush. It felt unnatural, like the forest had become still for a reason. I kept walking, trying to shake the unease gnawing at me. That's when I saw the tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were huge, too large for anything I recognized. The marks in the mud were deep, as though something heavy had been walking through the forest. I crouched down to examine them, my heart pounding in my chest. The prints were oddly human-like, but stretched, the toes elongated and sharp. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I heard it. A low growl, far off in the distance. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. The growl was followed by a shrill, inhuman screech that echoed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. I froze. The sound didn't come from the ground, it came from above. I spun around, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Something was out there, watching me. I started to run, my heart thudding in my chest, my legs pumping hard as I tried to retrace my steps back to the cabin. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees crowding together like they were trapping me in. The screeching noise came again, closer this time, followed by a series of heavy footsteps. Whatever was out there was gaining on me. I dared to look over my shoulder. There, just beyond the trees, I saw it. A massive shape, crouched low to the ground, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. It was watching me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The creature had the body of a man but was far too large, its limbs twisted and elongated. Its skin was pale, stretched tightly over its bones, and its mouth, wide and full of sharp, jagged teeth, hung open in a silent snarl. I ran faster, my legs burning, but it was no use. The creature was much faster than I was, moving through the forest with an eerie grace. I could hear its breath, low and labored, just behind me. I stumbled and fell, my hand brushing the wet earth as I tried to push myself up. When I looked up, I saw it again, closer now, emerging from the shadows, its massive frame looming over me. Its eyes, dark, hollow, and hungry, locked onto mine. Then, everything went dark. I woke up in the cabin, my body trembling with fear, my clothes soaked with sweat. My heart was still racing, my breath shallow. Had it all been a dream? I didn't know. But when I went to the door, I found something that made my blood run cold. The creature's claw marks were scratched deep into the wood. The legend of Bigfoot. I'd heard the stories before, campfire tales, warnings from locals, and hushed conversations in bars, but I never believed them. The stories about Bigfoot, the elusive creature said to roam the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest, seemed like nothing more than myths to me. I thought it was just another part of the folklore surrounding this quiet, foggy corner of the country. But that was before I went into the woods. It started with a simple weekend trip, just me and my buddy Mike. We'd rented a small cabin near a secluded part of the forest, far from the nearest town, with no plans other than to unwind and get away from everything. We were both hikers, so exploring the forest was top of our list. On the second day, we set out on a trail that stretched deep into the woods. The path was narrow, the trees dense, and the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. As we walked, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. Normally, there would be birds singing or squirrels rustling in the leaves, but there was nothing. The silence was so profound it felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Pretty eerie, huh?" Mike said, his voice breaking the silence. He was looking around, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "Yeah, I don't like it much," I admitted, glancing around. The trees seemed to loom over us, their trunks massive and twisted. We kept walking, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But then, something made me stop dead in my tracks. A sound. It was distant, but unmistakable, a deep, guttural growl, followed by what sounded like something large moving through the underbrush. It wasn't the sound of any animal I knew. I turned to Mike, but he was already staring at the forest, his face pale. "You heard that, right?" he whispered. "Yeah," I replied, my throat tight. What the hell was that? We stayed still, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind in the trees. Then, the sound came again, closer this time. A low, deep growl that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath our feet. "Get off the trail," Mike said urgently, grabbing my arm. "We need to get back to the cabin. Now." We turned to head back, but as we did, the growl came again, this time right behind us. The sound was so close that I could feel the vibrations in the air. My pulse quickened. I don't know why, but I turned around. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a massive figure. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and covered in dark, matted fur. Its broad shoulders and long arms hung by its sides, its hands massive and clawed. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could see its glowing eyes staring directly at us. I froze. My heart seemed to stop in my chest. The creature didn't move. It just watched us, as if deciding whether to approach or not. Its presence felt overwhelming, like it was not just a creature but an ancient force of the forest itself. Mike tugged at my sleeve, pulling me away. "Run." We sprinted back toward the cabin, branches whipping against our faces, the ground uneven beneath our feet. We didn't dare look back. The only sound was our own frantic breathing and the thundering of footsteps behind us. I didn't see it again, but I could feel it following us, its heavy footsteps matching ours. When we finally burst through the door of the cabin and locked it behind us, we both collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. That night, the creature didn't come any closer. But we heard it, its low growl, its heavy breathing, like it was waiting outside, watching. We left the cabin the next morning, not speaking much as we packed up. Neither of us wanted to stay another minute. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking at the edge of the trees. I haven't been back to those woods since, but sometimes, when I'm not in the quiet of nature, I feel eyes on me. And I wonder if Bigfoot is still out there, waiting. The shadow in the pines. I didn't believe in Bigfoot. The stories I heard were just that, stories. Tall tales passed around by locals in small towns to entertain tourists or scare kids. But when my friends convinced me to join them on a camping trip deep in the mountains, I figured there was no harm in a weekend of hiking and fishing. We'd been hiking for hours, the sun starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail. The forest around us was dense, with thick pines that seemed to block out the sky. The air had a chill to it, but the kind of chill that felt good after the heat of the day. We were miles away from the nearest town, far from the noise of civilization. I couldn't have asked for a more peaceful place. But as night began to fall, something changed. At first, it was subtle. A slight shift in the air, a feeling that the forest was watching us. We joked about it, talking about how eerie it felt to be so deep in the woods, so far from home. But then, as the darkness grew, so did the unease. We reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp. It was a beautiful spot, a small lake, surrounded by tall trees with just enough space to set up our tents. We unpacked quickly, the conversation flowing easily as we set up our gear. But that sense of being watched didn't fade. As we gathered around the campfire later, the atmosphere seemed to thicken. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional chirp of a distant cricket. But then, it came again, a faint sound. A rustling in the trees, just beyond the clearing. I stood up, squinting into the dark. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. The others stopped talking, turning their heads toward the woods. The rustling stopped, but something else replaced it, a deep, guttural growl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was low, almost like a hum, vibrating through the air. I couldn't place it. Probably just a bear, one of my friends said, his voice trying to sound confident. But there was a hint of doubt in it. We continued to sit by the fire, but the growling came again, closer this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the sound of a bear, or any other animal for that matter. It was something larger. Something far more powerful. Suddenly, the trees near the edge of the clearing moved. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I saw it. A massive shadow moving quickly between the trunks of the trees. It was too large to be any bear. Too fast to be a person. The outline of it seemed wrong, too tall, too broad. I stood up, my heart racing, as the shadow paused, its form visible only for a moment. And then, as if it knew I was watching, it stepped back into the darkness, disappearing completely. We all stood frozen, unsure what to do. The campfire flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. There was no sound now, just the pounding of my heart in my ears. "Let's pack up and go," I said, my voice tight. We didn't hesitate. The atmosphere had shifted entirely, the weight of it making the air feel thick and suffocating. We hurriedly packed our things, eyes constantly darting to the forest, half expecting something to emerge from the trees at any moment. By the time we had everything packed and started heading back down the trail, the air was heavy, oppressive. The growling stopped, but the feeling of being watched never left. I never went back to that forest. None of us did. But sometimes, when I'm out in the woods, alone or with friends, I can still hear it, the faint rustle of leaves, the deep growl carried on the wind. And I wonder if, somewhere in the dark, Bigfoot is still watching. The Watcher in the Trees. It was supposed to be an ordinary hike, just another weekend escape to enjoy the peace of the wilderness. I'd grown up in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by forests and mountains, so the idea of venturing into the woods for a couple of days didn't faze me. I even liked the solitude of it. The woods had always felt like home, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the whisper of wind in the trees, and the scent of pine that seemed to clear my mind. This time, I was alone. I'd come to a remote section of the forest that I'd never explored before, a place I had heard about from some locals, a hidden trail that wound deep into the heart of the woods. The sort of place that wasn't marked on any map, a place where you had to know the terrain to find it. I didn't mind getting lost. I liked the adventure. But as the hours passed, the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the trail. The forest, usually so alive with sounds, had grown eerily silent. No birds, no squirrels, not even the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was as though the entire forest had gone still. I paused for a moment, listening to the unnatural silence. The only thing I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I pushed the discomfort aside, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. And then I saw it, a figure, standing motionless between the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But as I blinked, the figure didn't disappear. It was tall, far too tall for a normal person, its head barely visible above the canopy. The shape was outlined in shadow, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. It didn't move. It just stood there, facing me, as if waiting. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. What was that? I took a step back, unsure whether to run or stay. The figure didn't seem threatening, at least not at first. It was like it was observing me, but the longer I stared at it, the more wrong it felt. I couldn't explain it. My instinct screamed at me that something was wrong, that it wasn't human. My foot slipped on a loose rock, and I stumbled forward, breaking the silence. The figure moved. It didn't walk, it glided, swiftly and silently, its tall, dark shape vanishing between the trees as if it had never been there. I didn't wait to see what else it might do. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. The trail blurred beneath my feet, branches scraping my arms as I tried to make my way back to where I had started. But the further I ran, the more I felt it. The sensation of eyes watching me from the trees, from the shadows. The sound of something following me, just out of reach, moving with the same unnatural speed. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, but the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. The path I had followed was no longer familiar. Every turn looked the same. The trees loomed closer, their branches tangled like claws reaching out to catch me. And then, just as my panic reached its peak, I saw the clearing, the spot where I had started. The familiar boulders by the creek, the old log where I had stopped to rest earlier. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I just kept running, right through the clearing and out toward the road. I didn't look back. When I reached the car, I slammed the door shut, hands shaking, chest heaving. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see something watching me from the trees. But there was nothing. Just the empty forest, silent and still. I drove home that night, my thoughts racing. I've been back to those woods a few times since, but I always keep to the well-worn paths, never venturing too deep. And every now and then, when the wind picks up and the trees start to sway, I can't shake the feeling that something's out there, watching from the shadows. The thing beneath the floorboards. I had just moved into the old house on the outskirts of town. It was perfect, a fixer-upper with plenty of character, nestled at the edge of a thick forest. I wasn't expecting much from the house, but it was affordable, and after a year of searching, it was the best I could find. From the first moment I stepped inside, something felt off. It wasn't the house itself, but the way it seemed to breathe. The floors creaked underfoot, the doors groaned when they opened, and there was always a slight chill in the air, even with the heater running. It was an old house, and I knew that meant problems, but I didn't mind. It had a charm, right? I spent the first few days unpacking, cleaning, and doing small repairs. It wasn't until the third night that I started to notice the sounds. At first, they were faint, a scraping sound, like something small moving across the floor. It was so quiet that I thought it was just the house settling. But then it happened again, louder this time, coming from the floorboards in the living room. I froze. I was alone. The house had been empty for years before I moved in, and I hadn't seen any sign of pests, no rats or squirrels. But the sound continued, a persistent scraping, followed by a soft thud, as though something was dragging itself beneath the floor. I tried to ignore it, convinced it was just old wood and pipes shifting. But the noise grew louder, more urgent. It sounded like claws dragging along the underside of the floorboards, something heavy, something big. I didn't know what to do. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floor, every shift in the house made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it, whatever it was close. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. The next morning, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I went into the living room, determined to figure out what was causing the noise. The floorboards looked normal, old, worn, but nothing out of the ordinary. But as I knelt down to inspect the area where the sound had been the loudest, I noticed something strange. A small gap. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. The boards weren't quite flush with the floor beneath them, creating a small opening. I could see something shifting beneath, something dark and moving. Without thinking, I grabbed a hammer and began prying at the boards. They splintered with ease, the old wood breaking apart under my hands. When I lifted the last of the boards, I expected to find a rat's nest or some forgotten piece of garbage. Instead, I found a hole, a small, hollow space beneath the house, deep and dark. And in the center of that hole, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at me. I recoiled, stumbling back, my breath catching in my throat. The eyes blinked slowly, then disappeared into the darkness below. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. And then it came. A scraping sound, so loud and close it felt like it was right next to me. Something large, was crawling up from beneath the floor, dragging itself toward me. I could hear its breath, labored and heavy, as it moved, inch by inch. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the front door, and when I looked back, I saw nothing, just the house, quiet and still. But I knew something was down there. Something that had been living beneath the floorboards, waiting for someone to uncover it. I left the house that night, never looking back. I don't know what it was, or if it's still there, but I'll never go near that house again. The whispers in the walls. I had never been one to believe in ghosts or strange happenings, but that all changed when I moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street. It wasn't my first choice, it was far from perfect, with creaky floors and walls that had seen better days, but it was affordable, and I'd been desperate to leave the cramped apartment I'd been living in. The first few nights were uneventful. The house was dark and cold, but I'd come to expect that from a building that old. There was one room, a small, unremarkable space at the end of the hallway that I avoided. I couldn't explain it, but something about it unsettled me. It was just a room, bare, with a single window that faced the overgrown backyard, but I always felt a strange pressure in my chest whenever I passed by it. I tried to push the feeling aside. But then, on the fourth night, it began. It started as a soft, faint whispering, just barely audible, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. At first, I thought it was the house settling, the old pipes or the wind, but it didn't stop. It was rhythmic, like a chant, and it seemed to move around me. I tried to ignore it. I tried to sleep through it. But the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the walls, growing closer, almost as if they were circling me. My heart began to race. I got up, switched on the light, and walked to the hallway, trying to locate the source of the sound. The whispering stopped the moment I stood still, but I could feel it just beneath the surface. The walls felt alive, like they were pulsating with an energy I couldn't understand. I was too frightened to stay in the room. I moved to the kitchen, sat by the table, and tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew it was real. The following night, I couldn't sleep at all. The whispering returned, louder than ever, and this time it was clearer, words, soft and distorted, like they were coming from the very foundation of the house. "Leave," they whispered. "You don't belong here." I couldn't stand it. I went outside, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But when I stepped out into the backyard, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. In the overgrown garden, under the glow of the moon, a figure stood. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to bend in unnatural directions. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I could see its eyes, empty, hollow voids that seemed to stare right through me. I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the ground. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. And then it vanished, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in a daze, pacing the house, unable to get the image of that figure out of my mind. The next morning, I tried to leave. I packed up my things, ready to abandon the house for good. But as I walked down the hallway, I passed the small room at the end, the one that had always made me uneasy. The door was open. I didn't remember leaving it open. Curious and fearful, I stepped inside. The room was completely empty, no furniture, nothing but the bare walls. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange. The walls weren't just cracked and aged, they were covered in something dark. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my hand brushed against the wall, the whispers returned. This time, they were deafening, overwhelming, as though they were coming from every direction. "Leave now," they screamed. "Leave before it's too late." Suddenly, I heard a thud from behind me. I spun around. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure. Its hood was down now, and I could see its face, pale, with twisted features, its mouth stretched in a grin that made my blood run cold. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I ran, stumbling through the hallway and out the front door, not stopping until I was halfway down the street. I never went back to that house. I couldn't. I don't know who or what was in those walls, but whatever it was, it didn't want me there. And I know, deep down, that it's still waiting for someone else to move in, to hear the whispers, and to meet the thing that hides in the shadows. The Man in the Reflection. I found the old mirror at a flea market on a chilly autumn afternoon. It wasn't anything special, just a tarnished gold frame, slightly chipped on the edges. But there was something about it that caught my eye, something that seemed to draw me in. It was cheap, almost too cheap for something that looked so old, so I didn't hesitate. I bought it, thinking it would be the perfect addition to my living room. The first few days with it were uneventful. The mirror hung in the corner of the room, reflecting the cozy space I had worked so hard to make my own. I'd occasionally catch my reflection, smile, and go about my day. But soon, something started to feel wrong. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker of movement in the corner of the glass, like a shadow darting by. I told myself it was the angle of the light, or my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But it happened again the next day. And the next. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling grew, like something was watching me from the reflection. It wasn't a cold, empty feeling, but one of curiosity. Something was in that mirror, and it was paying attention to me. Then one night, while I was reading on the couch, I noticed something in the reflection. It wasn't my own image staring back at me. There was a man. He stood perfectly still, just outside the edge of the reflection. He wasn't visible in the room, not physically. But there he was, his dark eyes staring directly at me, his face expressionless but somehow knowing. I jerked my head toward the mirror, but the room behind me was empty. No one was there. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked over to the mirror. The man was gone. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, but every time I looked into the mirror after that, I felt his presence. Sometimes he was just standing there, watching me. Other times, he was closer, almost leaning in, as if trying to reach through the glass. I started avoiding the mirror. I'd walk past it as quickly as I could, and I'd turn my back to it when I sat in the room. But no matter what I did, he was always there, waiting. The worst part? He started to move. It wasn't sudden, but one day I looked into the reflection and saw his hand reaching out, slowly, inch by inch. I felt my blood run cold as I froze, staring at the mirror. The hand moved closer, closer still, until I could almost feel it brushing against the glass. I took a step back. His fingers didn't touch the surface of the mirror, they pressed against it, as though the glass had softened just enough to allow them through. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, his eyes shifted, locking onto mine in the reflection. A chill ran down my spine as I saw his lips curl into a smile, a slow, mocking grin that made my stomach turn. The mirror began to crack. It was just a small line at first, but it spread quickly, splintering across the surface like ice. The man's smile widened, and I could hear a low, guttural whisper, though I couldn't make out the words. I turned to run, but the mirror's reflection seemed to follow me, its cracks and the man's smile stretching across every corner of my vision. I didn't know how long I was gone, but when I finally mustered the courage to return, the mirror was gone. The space where it had once hung was bare, the wood on the wall smooth and undisturbed. I never found out what happened to the mirror. No one I asked had seen it before, and I couldn't find any trace of it. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. And when I look closely, I can swear I see him again, his dark eyes watching from the shadows, waiting. The last day. It started on Wednesday morning, just like any other. I was sitting at my desk, the hum of the office lights buzzing in the background, when the first email came through. It was a local news alert, nothing out of the ordinary, I thought. But then the second email came, and the third. They all said the same thing, unexplained incidents across the city. Reports of attacks on pedestrians. I shrugged it off. After all, the news always overblows things. But something about the constant stream of alerts nagged at me. My boss called a meeting, and I quickly filed away my concerns, focusing on the task at hand. By the time I left work, the world outside felt different. People walked around like usual, but the air was thick with unease. I could see it in the way they glanced around, avoiding eye contact, clutching their bags a little too tightly. Something wasn't right. I stopped by the corner store to pick up dinner, and that's when I saw it. A thing, stumbling down the sidewalk. At first, I thought he was drunk, but then I saw his face. Pale, lifeless, eyes vacant, skin mottled with bruises and cuts. He moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet with tangled strings. I froze. He looked at me, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. There was no humanity in them, just empty, soulless darkness. I turned away quickly, stepping inside the store, hoping I had imagined it. But when I turned to pay for my groceries, the cashier was gone. The door was wide open, and I could see the man, or the thing, stumbling toward me. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe something deeper, like the feeling that this wasn't just some crazy person, but something far worse. I grabbed my bags and bolted out of the store. The world had gone eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by a tense stillness. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it. But I knew deep down that it wouldn't be enough. The thing outside had seen me. It would find me. Hours passed. I watched the news, but it was all chaos. News reports detailing similar sightings all over the city, some of them describing people attacking others, biting them, spreading something that couldn't be explained. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. This was real. I heard a knock on my door. My heart stopped. I crept to the peephole, terrified to look. When I finally did, I saw it. The same face. The same pale, lifeless stare. I held my breath, waiting. The thing on the other side knocked again. This time, more aggressively. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing. I needed to get out. I needed to leave, but I had nowhere to go. The world outside had changed in a matter of hours, and I didn't know if I could survive it. I went to the window and peered out, hoping for a glimpse of something familiar, but all I saw were more of them, more of those things. They were stumbling through the streets in droves, no direction, no purpose other than the slow, relentless drive to feed. I could hear their moans now, muffled through the walls. They were getting closer. I backed away from the window, my breathing shallow. I had to act. I grabbed what I could, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and shoved it into my backpack. I knew it wouldn't be enough. But I couldn't just sit there, waiting for them to break through. I had to try. I opened the door quietly, the hallway empty for now. The knocking had stopped, but I knew they were out there, somewhere, waiting. I stepped out, the weight of the silence heavy on my shoulders. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if anyone else had survived. But as I crept through the hallways, I knew one thing for sure: the world had changed, and there was no going back. I was on my own now. The sky wasn't right. It started with the sky. It wasn't the sort of thing you could put your finger on, but it was wrong. That pale, unnatural glow that stretched across the horizon at dusk, faint but unmistakable. It was the kind of thing that unsettled you without explanation. I was on a late-night drive to the cabin, a place I'd retreated to for the quiet and the distance from the world. The radio was playing softly in the background as I turned onto the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the thick trees. The air had a sharpness to it, crisp and uninviting, like something in the atmosphere had changed. I thought nothing of it at first, but as I parked the car and stepped out onto the porch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the usual sounds of crickets and distant animals absent, replaced by a heavy silence. Then the lights appeared. At first, they were distant, just faint, wavering lights in the sky, moving in unnatural patterns. I squinted, thinking they might be airplanes or satellites, but they didn't move like any of those things. They flickered in and out, disappearing and reappearing in the same spot. It felt wrong. I told myself I was imagining things. I went inside, locking the door behind me, though I wasn't sure why. The unease in my chest had only grown since I saw the lights, a feeling I couldn't push away. It wasn't just the lights, it was everything. The night felt thick, as though the air itself had weight. I sat by the window for hours, watching the lights pulse in the distance until something shifted. One of them, the brightest one, descended rapidly, lowering itself straight into the woods just beyond the tree line. I froze. My body tensed in response, instinctively urging me to leave, to get away from whatever was happening. But my feet remained glued to the floor, my eyes glued to the window. I couldn't look away. It wasn't until the next morning that I noticed it. The entire area around the cabin had changed. The trees seemed twisted, as if they had been bent in unnatural ways. The ground was disturbed, like something heavy had landed, leaving deep impressions in the earth. And then, there were the marks, strange, jagged patterns in the dirt, like something had dragged itself through the forest. I should have left then. But I didn't. Curiosity had overtaken me. As I made my way into the woods to see what had happened, I felt the air change again, this time heavier, almost electric. The ground beneath my feet seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't explain. And then I saw it. It wasn't far, maybe a mile into the trees. A strange, smooth object, like a ship or a craft, something I couldn't name, was embedded in the ground. Its surface was metallic, glistening under the sunlight, but it wasn't anything I recognized. No markings, no windows, just a dark, polished surface that reflected the woods around it like a mirror. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. I didn't know why I was moving closer, but I couldn't stop myself. The moment I touched the surface, the ground beneath me vibrated, and a low hum filled the air. It wasn't a sound I could hear so much as feel, vibrating deep in my chest. I stepped back quickly, fear gripping me. And then, as if on cue, I saw them. Figures. Thin, elongated shapes, shimmering in the sunlight like heat waves. They stood just inside the craft, not walking, but gliding, their movements so fluid they seemed to distort the air around them. I should have run, should have turned and never looked back, but I was frozen, watching as one of them stepped toward the opening of the craft. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were dark, too dark, like empty pits of blackness. It stared at me, and in that instant, I felt like it knew everything about me, as if it had been watching me my entire life. Then came the voice. Not a sound, but a presence in my mind. We've been watching. I couldn't breathe. The voice wasn't threatening, but the weight of it, the certainty, the knowledge in it made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, never breaking eye contact with the figure, until I turned and ran, tearing through the woods in a blind panic. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, the door slammed shut behind me. The lights in the sky were gone, but I knew they weren't gone. They were still there, somewhere, watching. Waiting. I haven't left the cabin since that day. I don't know if they'll come back. I don't know what they want, or if they'll ever leave. But I know one thing, they're still out there, and they're always watching. The Quiet Visitor. I had always been a skeptic, rational, practical, dismissive of anything that didn't make sense. So when I moved into the small, run-down house on the outskirts of town, I didn't expect anything unusual. It was affordable, peaceful, and close to nature, which was exactly what I needed after the chaos of city life. The house itself was old, with creaking floors and rooms that always seemed colder than they should be. But it was mine, and for the first few days, I was content. The quiet of the countryside was a balm to my frayed nerves. I unpacked, set up my life, and began to enjoy the solitude. But then, things began to change. Slowly at first. It started with the windows. At night, I would hear the faintest scratching sound, like something dragging against the glass. I told myself it was just the wind, the trees, the house settling. But each morning, the curtains were always pulled back just a little farther than I'd left them, as if someone had been watching me while I slept. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to paranoia. I was alone, after all. Or so I thought. One night, I woke up to a noise. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, faint, like whispers, but too clear to be the wind. I got up and moved toward the sound, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The noise seemed to be coming from the living room. When I reached the door, I froze. Through the crack, I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, dressed in dark, ragged clothes. It stood in the middle of the room, completely still, as though it were waiting for something. I couldn't make out its face in the dim light, but there was something about it that made my blood run cold. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart racing in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure turned and walked toward the door. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it move closer, its steps eerily silent on the hardwood floor. When it reached the door, it stopped. Its hand reached out, hovering just inches from the knob. I couldn't move. The door opened on its own. The figure stepped out into the hall, vanishing into the shadows. I don't know how long I stood there afterward. My mind was racing, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it was a dream or some trick of the light. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. It was real. The next day, I searched the house, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no broken furniture, no disturbance of any kind. Just the silence. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time, more urgent. I locked the doors and windows, but it didn't help. The figure was back, standing in the living room, waiting for me. I don't know how it found me, or why it kept coming back, but I started to feel it, its presence, like a weight pressing down on me. It followed me from room to room, always lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I stopped caring about anything other than the quiet figure that haunted my house. And then, one night, as I sat by the window, staring into the darkness, I saw it again. Only this time, it wasn't alone. There were others, figures, just like it, standing at the edge of the property, watching the house. Their eyes glowed faintly in the moonlight, and I knew in that moment that they weren't there to just watch. They were waiting for something. For me. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I packed up what I could and left in the middle of the night, not looking back. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can feel their eyes on me, always waiting, always watching. The unseen passenger. It was supposed to be a short drive. Just a quick trip from the city to visit my sister's house in the country. But something about that night felt different. The roads were empty, the moon full, casting long shadows across the empty highway as I drove alone in my car, the engine humming steadily beneath me. The quiet felt strange, as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. About halfway through, I noticed something. The rearview mirror. It kept catching my eye, not in the usual way, just an odd sense of something else in the reflection, something that wasn't there before. But I convinced myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on my tired mind. Then, the feeling started. It was subtle at first. A shift in the air. A slight, almost imperceptible weight in the passenger seat beside me. The kind of feeling you get when you're in a room and suddenly realize you're not alone. I looked over, but the seat was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, the unmistakable prickling on the back of my neck. I told myself it was nothing. I tried to focus on the road, but the feeling only grew stronger. It felt as if someone, something, was there, just inches away, breathing in time with me. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but all I saw was the road behind me. Empty. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the seat next to me. So quiet, I couldn't make out the words. Just a breathy, soft sound that chilled me to my core. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced to the side, my pulse quickening. The passenger seat was still empty. Was I hearing things? No, the whisper was real. I could feel it. Panic started to creep in as I drove faster, trying to shake off the feeling, to ignore the whispering that had now become more insistent. It wasn't in my head. It was too clear. The voice sounded like it was right next to me. Not speaking, but breathing, like it was waiting for me to hear it. I took a sharp turn onto a smaller road, trying to lose the sense of being followed, but when I looked back at the mirror, I saw it, just for a moment. A shadow, shifting in the back seat. I froze. My heart pounded against my chest. No one could have gotten in without me noticing. The doors were locked, the windows rolled up. Still, the feeling grew worse. The weight on the passenger seat was undeniable. The whisper came again, clearer this time. A name. My name. Emily. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the desolate road. The only sound in the car was my frantic breathing and the tires skidding over the pavement. But the whisper, soft, almost pleading, continued. It was coming from right beside me, and I could feel its presence, close, too close. I stole a glance at the passenger seat again, and my blood ran cold. There was someone sitting there now. A figure, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It wasn't a person, not really. It was more like a shadow of one. Its face twisted in a grin that was both empty and terrifying, its mouth slightly parted, as if waiting for something. I screamed, my hand trembling as I yanked the wheel to the side, slamming the brakes. The car skidded, the tires screeching, but the figure remained. The grin never wavered. The car came to a halt. I was no longer on the road, but on a patch of grass, the engine sputtering to a stop. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't hold the steering wheel. I turned, expecting to see the figure still there, but there was nothing. The seat was empty again. The air was still. The only sound was the thumping of my own heart. I sat there for a long time, breathing heavily, my mind racing. Could I have imagined it? Was I just exhausted, letting my fear get the better of me? I looked back at the rearview mirror. Nothing. But as I turned to look at the road ahead, I saw it, the faintest shadow, just on the edge of the horizon. It wasn't moving, but it was waiting. Watching. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I threw the car in reverse, my hands barely steady enough to grip the wheel. I drove off without looking back, not daring to even glance into the mirror again. The feeling of someone in the car never left me. I didn't stop driving until I reached my sister's house, where I stayed inside, locked in, until the morning light broke. And even now, as I lie in bed, I can still feel the weight of the presence beside me. That whisper still echoes in my mind. Emily. The Watcher in the Woods. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, just me, my backpack, and the quiet of nature. A 2-day hike through a secluded forest, far from the noise of the city. The idea of it was peaceful, and I relished the thought of being alone, away from everything. No phone, no distractions. Just the forest and me. I set off early in the morning, the air crisp with the scent of pine. The trail was well marked, and I was confident I could navigate it without any issues. The further I went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves slowly faded, replaced by a deep silence. I didn't think much of it at first. Forests are like that, I told myself. By late afternoon, I had reached a clearing where I decided to set up camp. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ground. I built a small fire, the crackling flames the only sound breaking the stillness. That's when I first felt it. A sensation that prickled the back of my neck, like I was watching me from just beyond my sight. I glanced around the clearing, but there was nothing, just trees, their dark trunks stretching high above, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But the feeling lingered, and the silence seemed to deepen, more oppressive. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. As the night wore on, the feeling didn't fade. It grew. My thoughts became more scattered, and I couldn't shake the unease that tightened in my chest. Every time I glanced into the woods, I swore I saw movement, something just beyond the trees, a shadow that wasn't quite right. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there. I decided to go to bed early, curling up in my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. The rustling outside my tent made my heart race, and I couldn't help but listen, straining to hear the faintest sound. The breeze? The trees? Or something else? A thud. It was unmistakable. A heavy footstep, too close to the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I lay perfectly still, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced through every possible explanation. An animal? A hiker? But the footsteps weren't like the soft padding of an animal. They were deliberate, slow, as if someone was moving with purpose. Another step. Closer. I held my breath, eyes wide, staring at the flaps of the tent. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited. A minute? An hour? Time seemed to stretch as I lay frozen, every muscle tense. Then, another sound. The faintest scraping, like something, or someone, was running a finger along the outside of the tent. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening. The next sound was unmistakable. A whisper. Not from inside the tent, but just outside, right next to me. The voice was soft, low, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there, unmistakably. Leave. The word was like a cold breath against my ear. My body froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I could only listen to the voice, deep, raspy, and yet somehow oddly familiar. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Time seemed to stretch, but eventually the voice faded. The footsteps moved away, slow and deliberate. And then there was nothing. I didn't dare open the tent, not until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When I finally emerged, there was no sign of anyone. No footprints. No disturbances in the ground. Only the quiet forest, unchanging, as if nothing had happened at all. I packed up quickly, hands shaking, not looking back as I made my way out of the woods. The entire time, the feeling never left me, the sense that something was there, just beyond my reach, watching me, waiting for me to leave. I never went back to those woods. And even now, when I walk through the trees, I feel that familiar sense of being watched. The silence is always there, just under the surface. Watching. The diner at the end of the road. It was well past midnight when I found it. The road had been long and empty, the only light coming from the dim glow of my car's headlights as I drove through the winding highway. I had been on the road for hours, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. I wasn't expecting to find anything open, let alone a diner in the middle of nowhere. But there it was, a small, run-down place, the neon sign flickering weakly in the night. I pulled into the parking lot, the tires crunching over the gravel. The diner had that old, greasy charm, the kind you find in movies about places stuck in time. The parking lot was almost empty, just one other car, an old sedan with the engine running, parked near the entrance. A cold shiver crawled up my spine, but my hunger and tiredness pushed me forward. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, the smell of fried food and something faintly sour hitting my senses. The diner was surprisingly warm, the kind of heat that wraps around you like a blanket when you've been out in the cold for too long. The inside was quiet. Too quiet. There was a waitress behind the counter, her eyes fixed on the menu in front of her, not acknowledging my presence. I slid into a booth by the window, glancing out at the dark stretch of road ahead. The flickering neon sign outside cast an eerie glow across the empty lot. I waited, but the waitress didn't come over. I looked up, trying to catch her eye. She was still staring at the menu, her face expressionless, as if lost in thought. I cleared my throat, a little awkward. "Excuse me, can I get something to eat?" Her eyes slowly lifted, and for a moment, she just stared at me, as if unsure whether she should respond. Then she nodded, her movements slow and deliberate, and walked over to take my order. I ordered a burger and fries, something quick. She didn't write anything down, just nodded again and walked back behind the counter. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was something off about the place. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of an old jukebox playing in the corner, the sound warped and distant. The other car, the one I had noticed when I parked, was still there, the engine running, though the driver hadn't gotten out. I thought it strange, but I shrugged it off. Maybe the person inside was just waiting for someone, or maybe they were as tired as I was. The waitress returned with my food, setting it down without a word. I nodded in thanks, but she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. I took a bite of the burger, trying to push the unsettling feeling down. It tasted fine, nothing spectacular. But as I chewed, I noticed something. The lights overhead flickered again, and I saw, in the reflection of the window, something moving outside. A figure. Tall, thin, walking slowly toward the diner. I froze. The figure was coming closer. It was too dark to make out any details, but there was something about the way it moved that felt wrong. I glanced around the diner. The waitress was still behind the counter, staring blankly at nothing. The other car was still parked, the engine running. The door to the diner creaked open, and the figure stepped inside. A man, tall and gaunt, his clothes ragged and stained. He stood there for a moment, just inside the door, scanning the room with a strange, blank expression on his face. He didn't seem to notice me or the waitress. His eyes were wide, but there was no recognition in them. Just nothing. He walked to the counter and sat down on one of the stools, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The waitress didn't move. She didn't even acknowledge him. He sat there for a long time, his eyes still locked on nothing, as if waiting. I wanted to leave. I should have left, but something held me there. The unease, the dread creeping over me, made it impossible to move. It felt like I was trapped in some kind of strange limbo, and the longer I stayed, the more real that feeling became. I looked at the man again, and this time, I saw it. His reflection in the window was different, distorted, like the image was bending. The shadow of his figure stretched unnaturally across the floor, longer than it should have been. Suddenly, the lights above flickered one last time, and everything went black. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, I heard it, the sound of movement, footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear. The figure, the man, was coming closer, his steps slow, deliberate. I could feel the cold air moving, the temperature dropping rapidly. I stood up, heart racing, ready to run, but when I turned to look for the door, it was gone. The door that had been there just a moment ago had vanished, leaving only blank walls in its place. I rushed to the window, but the reflection showed nothing but the same empty parking lot, and yet I could hear the sound of footsteps getting closer. I spun around, but the man was gone. The diner was empty, the waitress still standing behind the counter, staring into the distance. The door to the diner opened again. The man had disappeared, but I didn't need to see him again to know that I had to get out. I ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could to the car, not daring to look back. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, the lights of civilization pulling me from the darkness. But every now and then, when I drive down that stretch of highway, I wonder if I'll see that diner again, or if it was even real to begin with. The demon in the basement. The house had always felt strange to me. My family had just moved in, and while everything seemed normal on the surface, quiet neighborhood, well-kept yard, nice space, I couldn't shake the unease that crept up my spine whenever I was alone. It was the kind of house that felt too still, too perfect, like something was hiding just beneath the surface. It wasn't until I started exploring the basement that I realized exactly what. The basement door was in the kitchen, an old wooden door that creaked when you opened it. The stairs leading down were steep, narrow, and the smell of dampness hit you immediately. I had never been down there before. My parents told me it was just a storage space, but there was something about it that made me hesitate. There was a dark, oppressive air about the place, like it was holding a secret, something it didn't want anyone to uncover. One evening, I was home alone. My parents had gone out, and I was preparing dinner when I heard the creaking noise, faint at first, like someone was slowly walking on the basement stairs. I froze, my hand stilling on the knife I was using to chop vegetables. The sound stopped, then started again. Slow. Uneven. I told myself it was just the house settling, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I glanced at the door to the basement, and in that instant, I knew. Something was down there. Something that wasn't supposed to be. Curiosity and fear waged war inside me. I had to know. I had to see what it was. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked slowly to the door. The air around me felt thicker, colder. I opened it, the hinges groaning, and the smell of mildew washed over me. With each step I took down the stairs, the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. The beam of my flashlight flickered as if struggling against the darkness itself. At the bottom, I stood still, listening. The air was heavier here, and the silence was so thick it felt suffocating. Then I saw it. A shape, standing in the far corner of the basement, almost blending into the shadows. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, its outline too twisted to make out fully, but the faint glow of my flashlight caught its eyes. They were wide, unblinking, black pits that seemed to stare straight into my soul. I froze, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was as though the very air around me was pressing in, weighing me down, keeping me still. I was trapped in the basement, unable to tear my eyes away from that thing. Then, the figure moved. Slowly. Its limbs twisted in unnatural ways, like they weren't meant to bend that way. It took a step toward me, and I could feel it, the pressure, the malevolent force that emanated from it. The air turned colder, sharper. I finally found my voice. "What are you?" I whispered, though I was terrified of hearing the answer. The thing stopped moving. And then, in a voice that felt like it echoed in my skull, it spoke. "I am what was left behind." I didn't understand. I couldn't process what it was saying. All I knew was that it was there, and I was not safe. The darkness in the basement seemed to pulse around me, tightening, growing. It was as if the house itself was alive, and this creature was its beating heart. Before I could react, I felt a cold hand, sharp as ice, brush against my arm. The world spun around me, and I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. It rolled away into the dark, its light flickering out. In the pitch-black darkness, I could feel the presence of the thing closing in, its breath hot and foul on my skin. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. My legs were frozen, my chest tight as if I was being suffocated. I could hear its voice again, soft, like it was right behind me. "You shouldn't have come down here. You never should have come." With a burst of panic, I finally managed to move, stumbling toward the stairs. My legs shook as I scrambled up, the dark presence still following me, its breath just inches from my neck. The moment my hand grasped the door handle and yanked it open, I burst out into the kitchen, gasping for breath. I slammed the door behind me, my heart racing. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the basement door. I could still hear it, the faint sound of scraping, like claws on wood. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my parents, not my friends. Who would believe me? I never went back into that basement again. Every time I walk by that door, I feel its presence, lurking just beyond it, waiting. It watches me, waits for me to come back. And I know now, whatever it was, it's not finished with me. The Siren Song. I was a fisherman, used to the quiet mornings and the rhythmic motion of the waves. The lake where I worked was far from the bustling crowds, nestled deep in the forest, its waters dark and deep. It was a place I had known all my life, where the days passed slowly and the silence felt comfortable. But that all changed the morning I heard her. It started like any other day. I woke up before dawn, the air cool and damp, the water in the lake calm and still. I set out in my small boat, the oars creaking as I rowed away from the shore. The mist hung low over the water, the world muted in its embrace. I was used to the quiet, but this morning something felt different. A strange tension lingered in the air, something I couldn't quite place. I cast my nets and waited, my eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. The boat rocked gently with the ripples, and the only sound was the faint lapping of the water against the hull. But then, I heard it. A voice, soft and distant, almost like a melody carried by the wind. I stopped, my heart thudding in my chest. At first, I thought it was just the wind, playing tricks with my mind. But the voice came again, clearer this time, almost as if it was right next to me. It was haunting, beautiful, like nothing I had ever heard before. My hands tightened on the oars as the melody wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into the mist. I shouldn't have listened. I knew that then, but I couldn't stop myself. This song, sweet and sorrowful, called to me, tugging at something deep inside. I had heard tales of creatures in the lake, things that sang to sailors and lured them to their doom, but I never believed them. Not until now. I turned the boat slowly, my eyes scanning the water. It was hard to see through the fog, but I thought I saw movement, something gliding beneath the surface. The voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. I leaned forward, my breath shallow, eyes locked on the water, waiting for something to emerge. And then, I saw her. She rose from the depths, her long, dark hair trailing behind her like a cloak. Her eyes glowed in the dim light, a deep, unnatural green. She was beautiful, too beautiful, but there was something about her, something wrong, something that made my skin crawl. Her skin shimmered with the water, her body graceful as she moved, her voice rising with each note she sang. I should have turned the boat around. I should have rowed as fast as I could back to the shore. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. I was frozen, caught in the spell of her voice. She was a siren, a creature from the old stories. And she was calling me. Her voice wrapped around me like a chain, and before I knew it, I had leaned over the edge of the boat. My hand reached toward her, and I could feel the cold air rush toward me, hear the distant crash of waves, feel the pulse of something dark and ancient beneath the surface. And then, she smiled. It was a smile that didn't belong on a human face. Her teeth were sharp, jagged, like the edge of broken glass. Her eyes glimmered with something wicked, something hungry. I tried to pull my hand back, but it was too late. She lunged. Her fingers, long and webbed, wrapped around my wrist with inhuman strength, pulling me toward the water. Panic surged through me, and I fought against her grip, but it was no use. Her song had taken hold of me, and I couldn't escape. The water rose around me, cold and suffocating. Her face was inches from mine now, her breath a chilling whisper. "Stay with me," she crooned, her voice like the crash of waves on the rocks. "Forever." With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched my arm free, kicking and thrashing against her grip. The boat rocked violently, splashing water into my face, and I could see the shoreline just barely visible through the mist. I had to get back. I had to escape. I pushed with every ounce of strength I had left, swimming with everything in me. My heart pounded, my limbs burned, but I didn't stop. I reached the edge of the boat and hauled myself back in, gasping for air, my heart still racing. I didn't dare look back, not even for a second. I rowed hard, faster than I ever had, my muscles screaming in protest. The water behind me was silent now, the mist thick and heavy, but I could feel her presence, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. By the time I reached the shore, the sun was rising, casting a pale light over the water. The air felt lighter, the tension gone. But I knew she was still there, deep beneath the lake, watching, waiting. I haven't been back to the lake since. I don't know what she wants or why she chose me, but I know one thing for sure. The siren is still out there, and she will wait forever, singing her song for the next person foolish enough to listen. The visitors. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. My friends and I had rented a cabin in the woods, far from the distractions of the city. The cabin was small, tucked away on the edge of a lake, surrounded by tall pines. Perfect for some peace and quiet. We arrived in the afternoon, set up the fire pit, and spent the evening chatting and laughing, the crackling fire our only company. But as the night deepened, the calm began to feel off. The air grew colder, the wind whispering through the trees. My friend Sarah, always the skeptic, mentioned how quiet it was, no sounds of animals, no rustling leaves, just the eerie silence of the woods. I shrugged it off. Maybe it's just the season, I said. But deep down, I felt it too. Something was wrong. It was around midnight when we saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks, the shadows from the firelight dancing in the distance. But then I saw it again, clearer this time, something moving slowly between the trees. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and it moved with an unnatural, jerky motion. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Did you see that? I whispered to Sarah, my voice barely audible. She nodded, her face pale. We all turned toward the figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but it seemed to be moving in our direction. As it drew closer, I noticed something strange about it, the way it glowed faintly, like it was radiating some sort of pale light. But what really made my blood run cold was the way it walked. It didn't look human. Its legs were too long, its posture too rigid, almost mechanical. Before any of us could speak, a loud, high-pitched noise cut through the night, making my ears ring. It wasn't like anything I had ever heard before, not a bird or animal, but something sharp, metallic. The air seemed to hum with it. The figure in the trees stopped moving, then turned and began walking back, disappearing into the shadows. We sat there in stunned silence, too scared to move, not sure if we should even say anything. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was no explanation. Not one that made sense, at least. Around the fire, we tried to laugh it off, but the tension was thick. We didn't talk about it again, but we could all feel it, something was out there. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind outside, the rustling of branches, kept me awake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure glowing faintly in the trees. I rolled over in bed and stared out the window, the moonlight casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. That's when I saw it. A light in the sky, flickering in and out of view. It wasn't a plane, too slow, too erratic in its movement. It hovered for a moment, then darted in a sharp direction, as if it were watching us. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, too stunned to react. I grabbed my phone to call the others, but the signal was gone. Not even a bar. The light blinked again, brighter this time, before it shot off into the distance at an impossible speed. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw more movement, this time not in the sky, but in the trees. Shapes, more of them, moving swiftly between the shadows, too fast to be human. I grabbed the flashlight and rushed outside, the others following close behind. We stood together by the cabin, our eyes scanning the dark forest. I didn't know what we were looking for, but I felt it, an overwhelming sense that we were not alone. That's when we heard it, voices. Low, distorted, like static, coming from the trees, too soft to understand but unmistakably there. The ground vibrated beneath our feet, a low hum that seemed to be coming from the very earth itself. In a blur of panic, we ran toward the truck, but as we reached it, we saw them, figures, tall and thin, emerging from the forest. Their skin glowed faintly, just like the one we had seen earlier. Their eyes were dark, unblinking, and they moved toward us with an unnatural speed. We froze, not knowing what to do, not knowing if we could even outrun them. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the figures stopped. A single one of them stepped forward, tilting its head as if studying us. The air crackled, and for a brief moment, the world felt like it was holding its breath. Then, with a flash, they were gone, vanishing into the trees without a sound. We stood there, hearts pounding, the hum in the air finally fading away. We didn't know what had just happened or what we had seen, but we were all too terrified to stay. We piled into the truck and drove away, the night pressing in around us. We never spoke of it again, and the cabin, well, it's still out there, just waiting for the next group of curious souls to come too close. But I know one thing for sure, whatever we encountered that night, it wasn't human. And it's still out there, watching. The Girl Who Smiled. I first met Lily at the local coffee shop. She wasn't anyone special, at least not at first. Just another face in the crowd. She had short brown hair, a soft smile, and a quiet demeanor that seemed to draw people in. It wasn't until later that I realized how dangerous that smile really was. I had seen her around the neighborhood a few times, usually at the park or the bookstore, always alone. She passed by, nodding politely, but we never exchanged more than a brief greeting. But one evening, I noticed her sitting by herself at the coffee shop, staring out the window with an intensity that made me uneasy. I was a little out of place that evening, having just moved to the area, and the quiet solitude of the shop felt oddly comforting. I took a seat at a table near her, hoping to enjoy my drink without drawing too much attention to myself. But as I sat there, I couldn't help but notice her. She was still staring out the window, her eyes wide and unblinking, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. It was strange how perfectly calm she seemed. I watched her for a moment too long, and when she finally turned her head and met my gaze, her smile widened just a fraction. Something in the back of my mind told me that something wasn't quite right, but I shrugged it off. She was just another person, after all. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched. I tried to forget about it, chalking it up to nerves from the move and unfamiliar surroundings. But the next day, something changed. The news spread quickly. There had been a murder in the neighborhood. A young woman had been found dead in her apartment, the door unlocked and the place left in disarray. The police were baffled. No signs of forced entry, no obvious motive. It was a quiet neighborhood, and nothing like this had ever happened before. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then, a few days later, I saw Lily again. She was sitting in the same spot at the coffee shop, as if nothing had changed. Her expression was the same as before, soft, serene, but there was something behind her eyes. Something cold. I couldn't help myself. I walked over to her. "Hi," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's a strange thing. What happened, right?" Lily looked up at me, her smile barely twitching. She didn't answer immediately, just studied me with an unsettling calm. "Yes," she said finally, her voice like honey. "It is strange." We sat in silence for a while, the hum of the coffee shop around us, but the tension between us was palpable. Her smile never left, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It felt wrong, like it was hiding something. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A few days later, there was another murder. This time, it was a man found stabbed in his car. Again, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, just a brutal killing in the middle of the night. And again, the police were left with no leads. And again, Lily was there, sitting in the same seat, her eyes following me as I walked past. I couldn't ignore the connection anymore. It was too obvious, too strange. Something about her, something about the way she smiled, the way she seemed so unaffected by everything, made me feel sick to my stomach. One night, I followed her. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear. But I needed to know what she was doing, where she was going. She left the coffee shop after dark, walking slowly, as if she had all the time in the world. I stayed a few paces behind, keeping to the shadows. She turned down an alleyway, and I hesitated for just a second, but I kept going. That was when I saw it. There was a body. A man, lifeless and twisted, his eyes wide in terror. Blood pooled around him in the dim light of the alley. And standing over him, her hands drenched in red, was Lily. She was smiling, that same calm, serene smile. It was like she was proud of herself, like she had just accomplished something extraordinary. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, her voice soft but filled with an icy edge. "Now you know." I froze, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. The world seemed to spin around me, the sounds of the city fading into the background. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind racing. "You won't tell anyone, will you?" Lily continued, her voice like a whisper in the darkness. "Because if you do, I'll find you." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My body was paralyzed with fear. She stood there for a moment longer, watching me with those unblinking eyes, her smile never wavering. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The next morning, the police found another body. They never connected the dots, never found the killer. But I knew it was her. And as I walked past the coffee shop that morning, I saw her sitting there again, that same smile on her face. She was always there, watching, waiting. And I realized, too late, that the girl who smiled was never just a girl. She was a killer, a predator, and I was her next target. The abandoned house. It was the kind of house you'd expect to see in old stories, tall, with creaky windows and a wide porch that seemed to sag with age. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about it. We'd all passed by at some point, giving it the wide berth that only abandoned places seem to deserve. But for some reason, that day, I felt drawn to it. I had been walking home from work, my usual route taking me past the old house. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cracked stone driveway. The house stood at the end of a street, isolated, its peeling paint blending into the evening light. I stopped for a moment, staring at the broken fence and the overgrown garden that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity tugged at me. I hadn't been inside the house in years, not since I was a kid. My friends and I used to dare each other to go up to it, to peer through the cracked windows, but we never actually went inside. It was said to be haunted, but I wasn't a child anymore, and my curiosity was stronger than my fear. The door, surprisingly, wasn't locked. It creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the smell of mildew and dust greeting me as I stepped inside. The air was heavy, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for years, waiting for someone to disturb its silence. The interior was just as I remembered, though everything seemed darker now. The wallpaper was peeling, and the wooden floors creaked under my feet as I walked through the entrance hall. Dust settled on everything, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, as if the house had been frozen in time, untouched by the outside world. As I made my way through the house, a strange feeling began to creep over me, a sensation I couldn't shake, like I was being watched. At first, I chalked it up to nerves, but the longer I stood in the house, the more it seemed like the walls themselves were breathing, like they held something deep within them. I entered the living room, where an old fireplace stood, its hearth cold and dark. A single chair in the corner was slightly turned, as if someone had been sitting there recently. I couldn't explain why, but it sent a chill down my spine. I stood still for a moment, listening for any sounds, but the silence was suffocating. The floorboards groaned, and then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper, drifting from upstairs. I froze. I had come to explore the house, but now the house felt like it was exploring me. I had to see what was up there, so I made my way toward the staircase. It was narrow, winding, and looked as though it could collapse under the slightest pressure, but I climbed anyway. The silence was unbearable as I ascended, each step creaking under my weight. At the top, I hesitated. The hallway stretched out before me, shadowed, with doors lining both sides. I noticed the first door on the left was slightly ajar. The whispering sound seemed to be coming from that direction. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if there was really something or someone inside. I pushed the door open. The room was empty except for an old, wooden rocking chair in the corner. It was rocking slowly, almost as if someone had just gotten up and left it. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped closer, unable to take my eyes off the chair. The air felt thick in this room, and I could almost feel the presence of something or someone standing just out of view. A sudden coldness brushed against my neck, and I whipped around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. Only the eerie silence, stretching out like an endless void. I turned back to the chair, and that's when I saw it. The dust on the floor around it was disturbed, as if someone had recently been walking there. Slowly, I stepped back, my instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could move, I heard it, a loud bang from downstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. I spun around, my heart racing. The air felt heavier now, as though the house itself was alive, suffocating me. The footsteps continued, growing closer. I didn't wait to see who or what was coming. I turned and ran down the stairs, my legs trembling, my mind too panicked to think clearly. I reached the front door and yanked it open, stumbling into the cool night air. The house loomed behind me, silent once more, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I ran down the path, not daring to look back until I reached the end of the street, where I stopped, breathless. As I glanced over my shoulder, I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me. It was only for a moment, but I could make out the outline of a woman, her face pale, her eyes empty. I never went back to that house again. They say it's been empty for years, but every time I walk by, I feel that same presence, watching, waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can still hear the whispers. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.